Thanks, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on the part of the world you're in. It's a great pleasure to be here and chair this session. Many thanks to the organizers for inviting us to contribute to this session. In particular to Olivier and Amrita at the embassy. Thanks to all my speakers for being here. Dr. Ketal Wiesen and Dr. Punishlook Baduri already presented yesterday evening, but they are part of our session on marine biodiversity. And of course, to my co-chairs, Manal Zakaria and Vladimir Ripe for helping organize and coordinate this part of the Knowledge Summit. So briefly to comment on the session itself, we're bringing together a bunch of speakers to talk about various aspects of marine biodiversity in largely based. The work has been based in India. The work that Ketal, I think, presented yesterday also sort of references some of the work that we've done collaboratively. And I think what we're trying to do here is share some of the work that we've done, but also present ideas that can lead to potential collaborations between India and France. As everybody knows, this is a part of the world that is rich in biodiversity, but also rich in threats. And we've all, over the last couple of decades that we've worked here, faced numerous challenges in the conservation of marine biodiversity. And one of the most critical challenges is the lack of data, the lack of information, the lack of understanding of these ecosystems. And I think the work that some of our speakers today have done over several decades, and some of us are new entrants to the field. We're trying to bring that body of knowledge together and also look, examine how we might move forward towards the conservation of biodiversity, the sustainable use of resources, and of course, to satisfy our own curiosity in terms of a better understanding of these ecosystems. I'm also sort of happy to say that the session has people bringing a lot of different perspectives, and you heard some of those yesterday already, and you'll hear more today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Rohan Athol. Rohan's worked in the Lakshadweep Islands for over 20 years on coral reefs. He's been monitoring reefs there for 20 years and has one of the longest data sets on reefs in the Indian Ocean tropics. And he also, the last decade or so, has done extensive work on seagrass ecosystems. And he hates to admit it, but he's done a lot of work on the relationship between green turtles and seagrass. So over to you, Rohan. I'll let you take it away from here.
Thanks for that introduction, Karthik. Hang on. Okay. Can you see? Can everyone see the screen?
Yeah. Yes.
Anyway, thanks a lot for inviting me to present at this, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you. So, as Karthik mentioned, I've been working in the Indian Ocean now for more than 2 decades, with a focus on a very small group of islands in the northern Indian Ocean. And my talk today will focus on broad trends we've been seeing in these reefs and what they mean for essentially the long-term survival of the island. So while I started off working with trying to understand just the reef itself, it has expanded more to try to understand what it means for the people of the islands themselves. Okay. And of course, I'd like to mention up front that this is, of course, not just my work. It's the work of many other people who've been working over the last 20, 25 years along with me. So we've been increasingly being asked, to be, being called on as conservationists to give up on these stories of perpetual doom and to focus instead on stories of hope. And the theory, I think, is extremely elegant. You have a map graph that looks like this, where you have the ecosystem state on one axis and the social and ecological conditions on the other. And typically what you'd expect is that if you map a whole lot of reefs along this gradient, that as social and ecological conditions get worse, the ecosystem state also gets worse. This is completely normal, right? And most of your reefs will fall along this norm, okay, pretty much within these broad confidence intervals. But there will be a few reefs that misbehave, and these are the reefs that we need to actually look at. These are essentially reefs of hope. My good friend Josh Sinha and his colleagues have been pointing to. And what we really need to do, okay, is look at these locations that buck the trend. These are our reefs of hope. These are our bright spots, as Josh and his colleagues call it. We need to focus on these positive deviants and see what they're doing well. I think this is an extremely valuable approach, and I think it has fantastic, possibilities. It has shown success in improving child nutrition, in finding ways to handle disease, etc., looking at positive deviants. And I have actually very little doubt that it has powerful lessons to teach us in conserving complex marine systems. The difficulty for me is that when we look at these bright spots long enough, we find one of two things. Either the lessons they teach are highly contingent and therefore very difficult to transfer from one place to another. They're very peculiar to that place. Or they're very temporally contingent. If you follow the fortunes of these bright spots through time, their brightness might just ebb and flow quite a bit. And so we need to be a little careful. And to talk a little bit about these things, I'd like to, the Lakshadweep is for me a perfect example. And that's what I will focus on today. And for those who don't know, the Lakshadweep is a tiny archipelago of islands blown up here for, just for visibility. They're not really that big. In the northern Indian Ocean, they're atoll islands surrounded by coral reefs, part of the Chagos Lakshadweep chain ridge that includes the Maldives as well. It's the entire ridge is it's the largest ridge of atolls in the Indian Ocean. The Lakshadweep has one of the highest population densities in rural India, about more than 2,000 people per square kilometer. So these are not virgin atolls with nobody living on them. They're highly dense, and there's a huge amount of human presence on these islands. Over the last quarter of a century, the Lakshadweep has experienced at least 3 major massive El Nino events, each one more intense than the previous. There's probably one that happened in late 2020, but because of the pandemic, I have not been able to look at them. I have started looking at the reefs from 1998. I first surveyed it in 1998 when the reefs were already pretty heavily bleached. It was clear that the reefs here were quite devastated. They were really badly bleached. And in a little bit more than a year, some reefs looked like this, completely barren dead zones, reduced to rubble and taken over completely by algae. Looking at these reefs, I was convinced there was no way that the system could recover. This was a start of a classic phase shift, and that all I would be doing over the next few years was to read out a familiar litany of decline that was emerging from so many other reefs around the world. But it became pretty clear that the reefs of the Lakshadweep are going to not make it so simple. There was a huge amount of variability of response. And it is becoming obvious that for some reefs, at least, benthic recovery was taking place at a galloping pace. There's some reefs that were recovering really well within the first decade. But as you can see, well, almost, there were some reefs that were doing well, but some reefs that were not doing so well. And from here, if you look at the broad trends, the west-facing reefs did consistently better than the east-facing reefs. The mechanisms for this difference is something that our group has been trying to unpack for more than a decade right now. Okay, so this is where the bleaching took place. Okay, and after that, you have this major decline followed by some kind of major recovery on the west, but not so much on the east. So we began looking at the impacts of what's causing the differences between eastern and western reefs. What is evident is that aspect plays a critical role in determining ecological processes. So western and eastern reefs in Lakshadweep represent 2 starkly different exposure regimes related to the southwest monsoons. As you can see, most of the islands orient themselves in a roughly north-south kind of axis, and the 5 months of the monsoon strongly affects the western aspects of these islands. And if you plot the recovery that I showed you, okay, the benthic recovery that I showed you of coral cover, across this exposure gradient, you get something like this, okay, after the first bleaching event. What you have here is the amount of recovery after the 1998 event, and this is a measure of exposure. And you can see a clear relationship that the highly exposed reefs recover much, much faster than than the sheltered reefs. And we can discuss the mechanisms later on if we want to. But it's something that that this difference in exposure and recovery rates actually plays out in a whole lot of ecological processes, not merely in coral cover. So the point that I want to try and make here is that in the first decade of working in the Lakshadweep, it is that, after that first major coral mass mortality, I was convinced that the Lakshadweep was one of those bright spots that we spoke about at the start. Lakshadweep was clearly a reef of hope, bucking the trend of the rest of the world. For me, Lakshadweep was like a living example that climate change may not be so bad after all. Some reefs would certainly be bad, but overall, given enough time, reefs have the ability to bounce back. Okay. If I try to unpack the anatomy of this bright spot, it became clear that the Lakshadweep system was, what the Lakshadweep system was doing right. This is a cartoon drawing of the typical Lakshadweep island with its, its island, its beach, its lagoons, and all the other ecosystems. And the lagoon is enclosed by a fringing reef, beyond which are the pelagic waters. Okay. And if I put on top of it all the human infrastructure of the system that's built on top of this enclosed framework, including the growing populations, the coconut plantations, the housing, the physical infrastructure, and the freshwater, all of this is the social ecological system of the Lakshadweep. And in this cartoon version of the island, the entire social ecological system is dependent very much on the integrity of this outer reef. And for low-lying atolls like Lakshadweep, the outer framework is the best defense against disturbances. This becomes, particularly in the context of climate change, this becomes very important. So after the 1998 bleaching, the reefs recovered at rates faster than I expected, due, I think, most in part because human pressures in the reef were actually quite low. Local fishers, while they depended on the fish, they fished mostly for pelagic tuna, leaving the reef processes linked to the fish largely intact. And I think that's one of the mechanisms by which you have this, the reef becoming much more resilient than I actually expected. So the lessons from the Lakshadweep seem clear. If you want to have your reef still relatively healthy in the face of climate change, make sure that local pressures are low. Many reefs still have enough resilience to buffer the worst impacts of climate change. So that's my story for the first 10 years. But of course, I've continued to work in the Lakshadweep. And as I said before, if you stare enough at these bright spots, things change. And the reef got hit in 2010. And once again, it got hit in 2016. Okay. And with every ENSO event, it was the next ENSO event was larger than the previous time. And the reef response was quite different from the first time around. While after the 1998 event, we had a sharp recovery at some sites, post 2010, the reefs were barely managing to limp back to health before it was hit by another disturbance. And this has continued, okay? And it becomes very, very clear when you look at it along that same graph that I showed you, looking at the effects of exposure on mediating recovery rates. This was what happened post 1998 in terms of recovery. That's what happens post 2010, the same pattern in terms of recovery, but much lower. And that's what happens post 2016, even lower than that. And the relationship between exposure breaks down a little bit. So that initial reef of hope that I presented starts becoming less and less hopeful as you look at it through time over the 20-year decade, over 2 decades. And along with this, okay, the first mechanism that I talked about, which is about reduced pressure on the reefs, that itself has been changing from about 2014, 2015. And the fishery, which was holding up the resilience of the reef, was rapidly giving way to a growing commercial fishery for benthic species from the reef. This is an uncontrolled reef fishing. The reefs are rapidly being emptied out now of their large predators. And most of the fish that's being caught in many of these islands is not being consumed locally. It's being caught and then transported. More than 80% of it is being transported to the mainland for global markets. So that's where we stand, with the reef rapidly declining and its social ecological resilience slowly unraveling. The question now is much larger than whether the reefs will remain healthy. The question is much more existential. Will the reef itself remain habitable? Over the last few years, one thing that I'm trying to understand is the survival potential of these reefs themselves. Okay, it's an existential question. So my team has shifted very much looking at how reef processes link to the ability of people to live on these islands. Karthik, how much time do I have left?
I think you have 3 minutes left, 3-4 minutes.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Leaving time for a question.
So Virginie Duvat from Rochelle University in France, together with many colleagues from the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, they recently put together a really nice, insightful paper which discussed these 5 critical pillars of human habitability on atoll reefs. This is a basic list of essential factors that need to be evaluated if atolls need to remain livable into the future. So they include land stability, freshwater, food security, human infrastructure, and access to having a livelihood. They say that these are the basic elements that you require for atoll islands to remain habitable and for people to survive on these islands. And when I think about it, and Duvat and et al. also mention this, is that all these 5 pillars of habitability begin and end at the reef crest. The integrity of that reef framework underlies many of these basic pillars of human well-being. Eventually, the ability of the reef framework to keep growing and repairing itself is going to be critical to how much these pillars are maintained. So we've been, over the last couple of years, we've been exploring the accretion potential of the Lakshadweep reefs to see how well they've been standing up to these repeated disturbance events. We've been using a census, but very simple but powerful census-based method developed by Chris Perry and his team to measure the carbonate budget on the reef. This calculates the net accretion a reef is capable of by evaluating the growth potential of all the accreting organisms, like the coral and coralline algae, etc., and extracting from that all the erosional components by parrotfish, sea urchins, sponges, etc., etc. Just as a benchmark, healthy reefs require between about 5 to 10 kilograms per meter square of calcium carbonate per year to maintain their essential buffering function. So let's keep that in mind when we look at some of these initial results. So while these are just preliminary, okay, they're very instructive. So there's a fair amount of variability between reefs, and that's important to make sure. Carbonate production was low across all the islands. It doesn't meet the benchmarks at all. This is just the production component. And Kavaratti was among the lowest. Kavaratti, just to let you know, is the capital, which has about 13,000 people living on it. Here, carbonate production was actually the lowest. If you look at parrotfish erosion, there's actually a fair bit of difference. And particularly, I'll draw your attention to Agatti. Agatti is an island with fishermen, and there's a huge amount of reef fishing there. And there's a lot of parrotfish being taken out right now. And that's probably contributing to these low parrotfish numbers that we see in Agatti. And when we look at urchin erosion, okay, there you see that Kavaratti, the urban capital, has very, very high rates of urchin erosion, among the highest that we've been able to find. And we don't know what the reason for this is, but it's most likely because of nutrients coming from the highly urban islands. In the final analysis, when you take all of this together, you get the net carbonate production. And it shows that none of the reefs have rates of accretion that meet the standard of 5 to 10 G that healthy reefs require. The urban capital with 13,000 people that's the most worrying of the lot. The rates are hovering around 0, and some reefs are already net eroding. Okay, so this is a clear existential risk for people who are living in the capital of the Lakshadweep. So we are using these rates of reef accretion now, and we can project reef buffer capacities against climate change scenarios of sea level rise. And what we see is that only under the most optimistic scenarios will reefs be able to buffer sea level rise. Okay, we'll explain this later on if you wish. And our recent models are showing that under our coastal inundation maps show that many southern locations are likely to be inundated much, much sooner, at least as business as usual scenarios. Okay, this is based on the worst case scenarios, but we are likely to see that southern locations of many islands are probably going to be lost fairly soon. So the Lakshadweep today stands at a turning point. On the one hand, global climate change is undercutting the reef framework that protects the habitability of the islands. At the same time, regional and global markets, driven by global capitalist networks, are placing pressures on the natural resources that could actually buffer the resilience of these reefs against climate change. And to add to that, there are a whole lot of state-led developmental agendas which seem to be blind to both the climate change consequences as well as the market-based impacts on these reefs. There are a whole lot of new proposals for the islands that are completely at odds with the extreme vulnerability of these islands. So if the social ecological system of Lakshadweep has to remain habitable over the century, I think we'll need serious rethinking of the trajectories of development and ecosystem conservation on these islands. Lakshadweep is no longer the bright spot that I thought it was 10 years ago, but it has shown that it has a potential for a lot of resilience. But I think we need to give it the right set of conditions. And that for me leaves me with a small sliver of hope. Thank you.
Thanks, Rohan. I think we have time for one question. If we have it now, or we can take it at the end of the session as well. We follow the 5-second rule for end of the talk questions, so that we can try and finish somewhere within our expected time frame. Thanks, Rohan. I think there might be more when we have a discussion at the end of the session. That was it's a remarkable piece of research, but obviously the message is does not give us cause for optimism, but nevertheless, I think is this kind of information that then allows us to drive policy. So thanks again, and let me call on our next speaker. Dr. Sonia Sukumaran is at the National Institute of Oceanography in Mumbai and works on marine biodiversity, ecosystem function, and pollution. She's particularly done a substantial body of work on microbenthos. And today she will be talking to us about evaluating resilience of estuarine benthic communities via taxonomic and functional approaches. Dr. Sukumaran, if you would put your video on as well. Over to you.
Starting.
Look, yeah, please.
Am I audible and visible? Or slides
Yes.
visible?
The slide is visible, yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Karthik, for the introduction. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on our time zones. I'm Sonia Sukumaran, and working at the CSI National Institute of Oceanography Regional Center, Mumbai. Today, I will be talking on evaluating resilience of estuarine benthic communities via taxonomic and functional approaches.
I'm sorry to interrupt in the between. Maybe you can just put the screen on slideshow mode if possible.
I think there is an issue.
Abhishek, for either her or for me. So, but what you could do is increase the zoom into the slide a bit more, and I think that might, yeah, you could use the zoom on the right bottom corner just to increase the size of the slide. At 90% now, and
Now shall we?
you can just increase the size.
One second, I'm just getting some technical.
Sure.
No, something is wrong with the slide system. I need to do something for my slides. That's what you're saying?
Yes, you can press F5 or you can just go on the top. There is a slideshow option. Can you see on your screen?
Okay. One second.
The first option from the beginning.
Is this okay now?
No, ma'am. The thing which you can see option like from beginning, and on top at the end there is resolution, right? Okay. Sonia ma'am, can you hear me? Yeah, the slides are moving perfectly, ma'am. Just request you to increase the size of the slide so that like it can be visible to everyone. Okay, if you're not getting that, no worries. At the bottom, can you just increase the zoom?
That's what I was suggesting. Yes, that looks great. Yeah, that's much better. Perfect.
Yes, ma'am, you can proceed.
Is this okay now? Hello?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely.
Okay. What is this? This has to be. Why this is on this?
Yeah.
Sorry, the interruptions.
No worries. Please go ahead.
We start again. Macrobenthos are known to be powerful indicators, bioindicators that can integrate conditions over a period of time due to its intrinsic characters. Oh, it's not moving. Okay, now it's. Over a period of time, the merits of macrobenthos is that they're sedentary, they're long-lived, they have rapid responses to multiple kinds of disturbances, and they can integrate conditions over a period of time. It is also, besides this, they were also important for ecological processes such as nutrient cycling, global carbon and geochemical processes, secondary production, pollution metabolism and burial, sediment stability, and transport. So then the important question that arises are whether loss of biological diversity of marine benthic ecosystems can still sustain the same ecosystem services. The answer is both yes and no. Some species loss does not result in substantial alteration of system function. However, the loss of some species may have serious direct or indirect consequences. The problem is that it is rarely known whether a given species or a group of species is critical, making the reduction of biodiversity a dangerous practice with potentially dire consequences. Here I present a schematic simplification of ecological relationship among sedimentary fauna in oceans, and the stars indicate the ecosystem processes that sedimentary organisms are involved in. So marine benthos is arguably the largest ecosystem on Earth, and ecosystem processes occurring within it can have important effects both locally and globally. Within the marine benthos, it is perhaps in shallow coastal habitats that a relationship between species richness and ecosystem processes needs most urgently to be ascertained. And world over, coastal habitats have been heavily impacted, which often results in their macrofauna communities having reduced diversity. So now there is a lot of literature which indicates that the presence of a species of macrofauna and the specific traits are significantly affecting ecosystem processes like nutrient cycling, gas and climate regulation, bioremediation of waste, and therefore it is very important to study their biological traits. As such, research has recently moved towards including functional attributes while evaluating the effect of stresses, and analogous to taxonomic-based approaches, insights regarding what these organisms do within the habitat potentially can improve our understanding of the benthic ecosystem functioning. Ecosystem functioning is a collection of processes, services rendered, and resilience to various stresses. So in natural systems such as the estuaries, the benthic structure and function may respond in a similar manner or independently, thus linking the two still remains a key challenge. Biological trait analysis assesses ecosystem function in marine benthic environments using a series of behavioral, life history, and morphological characteristics of species to define ecological function. It is a multivariate approach that combines the structural data of taxa with the information of functional traits. BTA can further be used to study the functional diversity, which is the breadth of functions performed by species in assemblage. When the species in an assemblage differ greatly in their functional traits, higher values of functional diversity are expected. However, the problem is the exact form of the relationship between the diversity and ecosystem function remains unknown. Studies applying the BTA approach on macrobenthic communities in tropical estuaries are extremely scarce or restricted to certain areas. With this background, we conducted a study in 2 estuaries along the northwest coast of India, with the aims to assess, compare, and link the macroinvertebrate taxonomic and functional structures, and to evaluate the resilience of estuarine benthic ecosystems by employing multiple traits. This is a graphical abstract of the work that we have conducted. We analyzed the taxonomic and the functional profile, derived the functional ratio, and investigated the functional redundancy to understand whether the ecosystem resilience was low or high. We shall talk about it in detail in the further slides. Okay, so the 2 estuaries that we selected was Kundalika and Vashishti along the northwest coast of India. Both were exposed to diverse anthropogenic pressures of various intensity. Kundalika more so than Vashishti. Salient features are just presented below. The estuarine segments of Kundalika and Vashishti under the investigation were divided into 3 zones.
So just 1 second.
Yeah.
I think there's a few comments over here. The slides don't seem to be changing for the others. Have they changed on your screen?
No, it is not changing. Only second slide. It is stuck to the second slide, please. Sonia, just have a look at it.
Oh, okay. But for me, it is changing. I really don't know what's happening.
Yeah, no, this is a problem we've encountered in Zoom before. I think maybe the simplest thing would be to just unshare and share again. And I think that sometimes
Okay. It seems my slide is not changing. I'll unshare and then share it again. Okay.
Yeah. These are the joys of online meetings.
Unshare. Stop sharing. Stop sharing. Stop sharing.
It's now jumped to slide 5. Yeah, this.
Now share screen. No, share. No, share.
Yeah. Do you want to just go back and forth once just to see that it is?
Yeah, I'll do that.
Slide 5 now, slide 6.
Okay, 1 second. Is it on screen?
Yeah. We can see the slides. It looks fine.
Is it changing now?
It's on slide 5, aims. Do you want to go back 1 slide and forward?
Okay. 1 second. This one, is it changing?
No. I think you should. Is it on slideshow mode?
Yes.
No. I think take it off slideshow mode because it's not going on to slideshow mode for us at all. Just have it in the regular mode. Now it went back. Yeah.
This is better.
Yeah. I can see it now. Yes, absolutely. Now we can see.
So I increase this.
I think that's fine. If you increase it further, we won't be able to see the edges.
100.
A little bit. You can zoom in a bit. At maybe 140. Yeah, that's perfect. Yes.
All right. So I should not go on slide. Complete slide share.
Yeah. This is. I think that's we're on.
Okay.
Yes.
So I was here. Should I start from here back or?
Yeah. Sure. Please.
Should I go back or start from here?
That's fine. Please go ahead.
Okay. So basically, shall I continue?
Please. Yes. Absolutely.
So basically, we sampled in 2 estuaries, Kundalika and Vashishti, and we divided each estuary, we had 10 stations each. And the stations were divided into 3 categories: the outer zone, the middle zone, and the upper zone, based on the distances from the sea. And sampling was conducted for 2 years consecutively during the pre-monsoon and the post-monsoon season. And for the studying the functional trait analysis, we selected 11 biological traits with 45 modalities, which we felt was sufficient enough and gave sufficient information with respect to life history, morphological and behavioral characteristics. And the BTF procedure was adopted, wherein each taxon was assigned to the trait categories depending on the affinity, using the fuzzy coding approach. So this approach was used to account for multiple trait categories of an individual taxon and allowed to capture the oscillations in the affinity of a given taxon to the different modalities of a particular trait. For example, an organism could opt for carnivory and could switch to deposit feeding or suspension feeding some other time, depending on the resources. And so using this procedure, we could assign values to all of them at the same time. Each modality was allocated a score range between 0 and 3, where 0 conveys no affinity, 1 and 2 indicated partial affinity, and 3 expressed high affinity. Also, a species could exhibit different scores for more than one modality trait. For instance, if a species exhibited all trait modalities equally and there were 3 categories, then each modality will be assigned a value of 1, so that the total value for each specific trait is 3. And if a species showed affinity towards any one of these modalities most of the time than the other modalities, then this modality would be assigned a higher score than the others. So in this manner, a trait by station matrix was constructed by multiplying the fuzzy coded scores of each taxon by its abundance at each station, and the trait categories were summed over for all the taxa, and based on this matrix, we applied the fuzzy correspondence analysis to understand the functional trait trends. From the taxonomical analysis, we could obtain 126 species from 73 genera, 104 from Kundalika, and 85 from Vashishti. I've just put up some of the species pictures categorized as pollution sensitive. The stars indicate the more dominant types, and these are the pollution tolerant macrobenthic taxa, the opportunistic macrobenthic taxa, and now coming to the composite MDS plot, the multidimensional scaling plot based on the taxonomic data indicated a separation of the stations belonging to both estuaries, which indicated the macrobenthic communities were quite different, though there was some overlap also indicated. Now coming to the individual plots, zone-wise spatial variations in macrobenthic community structure were distinguished for both of these estuaries, and this distinction was particularly clear in the case of Kundalika, whereas in the case of Vashishti, the lower zone was very distinct, whereas the upper and the middle zones were mostly merged together. Now, coming to the FCA, the fuzzy correspondent analysis confirmed that several traits contributed to the variance in benthic ecosystem functioning, displaying considerable functional heterogeneity. Now, the traits that were observed in the lower zone, the green color marked in both the estuaries, were similar. This could be because the lower fluctuations of salinity in the lower zone must have resulted in stable conditions leading to similarity of characteristics. In general, it was observed that the dominance of trait modalities were related to the abundant species occurring in the respective zones. For instance, the similarity in macrobenthic functionality between the lower zones of both estuaries could be attributed to the equal dominance of the opportunistic polychaete paraparinosphere patients in this zone, resulting in similar functional attributes. The functional trait groups are very distinct at the middle zone and upper zone of Kundalika due to the presence of different combination of species in the respective zones. There were more sensitive types in the middle zone, and only opportunistics were seen in the upper zone. Whereas in the case of Vashishti, it was all merged in the middle zone and the upper zone due to the analogous dominance of the polychaete Corophium volutator. So thus, we understood that the variability in taxonomic composition and species dominance could potentially influence the functional composition at different estuarine sections as well. So the less impacted lower zone had more traits, more types of traits, while the mid to upper zones that were subject to both anthropogenic and natural stresses had fewer traits. Now, the resilience of an ecosystem is dependent heavily on more species of different sensitivities undertaking similar functions, which enables it to withstand various perturbations even after the loss of some taxa. Now, taxonomic analysis revealed that the macrobenthic communities followed a continuum of higher species diversity at the lower zone to lower diversity at the upper zone. However, in terms of functional diversity, both estuaries displayed contradictory trends, wherein Kundalika followed a decreasing pattern from lower zone to the upper zone, mirroring the taxonomical trend, whereas Vashishti showed somewhat different trends. It had a more stable functional diversity with slight enhancement at the upper zone. The important functional attribute is that as the ratio of functional diversity to species diversity increases, the functional redundancy decreases and vice versa. So lower functional redundancy implies diminished ecological redundancy, resulting in loss of unique traits and impaired functioning. Low functional redundancy indicated that the constituent species had unique functional roles, and this was observed at the upper zone of Kundalika and Vashishti. Conversely, high functional redundancy was seen at the lower zone and the middle zone of both estuaries. This indicated that several species performed similar roles, enabling ecosystem functions to be maintained despite loss of species. Now, functional redundancy is defined as the portion of functional traits shared by the species of a community. Functional redundancy also proposes that the substitution of some taxa that perform similar functions in ecosystems may result in very little impact on the functional processes. So therefore, functional redundancy is considered as a proxy for resilience of an ecosystem in the face of various environmental changes. It is also now understood that ecosystems with high species and functional diversity are steadier and can withstand environmental upheaval. In our study, the Kundalika displayed an incremental linear relationship between both diversities, exhibiting low redundancy unlike the Vashishti. This implied that for every increase of species diversity, there's an increase of functional diversity, resulting in species with unique functions, making them irreplaceable. The Vashishti showed a flat horizontal relationship between species diversity and functional diversity. This signaled that increasing species turnover may not result in increased functional diversity, which could be probably due to trait convergence. And high functional redundancy ensures that a relative independence of community functions from species turnover. So therefore, it is of much importance and it should be taken into account during assessment of environmental perturbations on the ecology of any systems. Now, there is a caveat to this. Very high functional redundancy can result in functional weakness in the sense that when many species excessively subscribe to a small number of functions, the ecosystem will face a loss of several other critical functions. Therefore, functional redundancy and functional diversity are both equally important for the sustenance of ecological processes of the estuary. Coming to the conclusions, multiple traits contributed to the variance in benthic functioning, displaying considerable functional heterogeneity. Taxonomic and functional structural patterns in the estuaries differed across the estuarine zones and were independent of seasonality. The functional complexity at different estuarine sections were influenced by the variability in taxonomic composition, species dominance. The relationship between functional and species diversity were equivocal. Hello?
Yeah?
I was muted, I thought, okay.
We lost you for a second, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, functional redundancy and functional diversity are both equally important for the sustenance of ecological processes of the estuary. And a more consistent functional structure, higher FR and substantial proportion of recolonization traits suggested better resilience in Vashishti than Kundalika. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Sukumaran. It was great to hear about that work and the detail, and I think that's going to take us a while to sort of like process that. We've lost a little bit of time with all of the technical glitches, so I think we'll move forward to the next presentation, and we'll sort of take up any questions either during discussion or as has been as we've been doing with Rohan's presentation. We can also have questions on the chat box.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Next, gives me particular pleasure to invite and introduce Dr. Baba Ningulay. He's been a stalwart of marine biology and ecology at the National Institute of Oceanography as a scientist from about the mid-1980s recently, and he's now at the National Center for Polar and Ocean Research. And I think his work in an institute that sort of predominantly focused on physical oceanography and chemical oceanography, that pioneered ecology and biological work, has paved the way for many, many researchers and multiple generations after him. So I will, without sort of further ado, I will invite him to talk about benthic biodiversity of the Indian Ocean and the implications of deep sea mining to us today.
Dr. Karthik, is my presentation visible?
Your presentation is visible. Would you like to try the slideshow mode once to see if it does work? And,
yeah, this is the first one. This is second one.
The slides are moving, yes.
Okay. Shall I go ahead?
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
yeah.
Would you be able to minimize the window to the left, the one with the slide? Is it possible to just?
I can do it. I can do it. Yes.
Yeah. I think that's sufficient.
I think so. I can even do this. That should be fine. Is it okay?
It's not a slideshow mode for us. So
for me, it is in the slides show. So it is moving. If it is,
it's not moving for us.
Is it?
Sir, if you need to get onto slideshow mode, you'd probably have to go to slideshow mode first before pressing share.
You can find that
mode. So I'll have to
unshare first.
Okay, let me just close down the stop sharing, and then okay, I did it. Okay. Now,
so before sharing the slide, you have to in presentation mode, you have to be on a slideshow mode, and then on Zoom you can do a share screen, and then you can just grab the screen from there.
Again, I don't know why this is, but then I have to come back to the.
Yes, you have to come back to Zoom then.
Yeah.
So you can
not, that is not possible.
Yes, you can press Alt. Can you see ALT button?
After going to the share?
No.
Huh? Before?
So you are on share screen, right?
Right now I'm not on share. Yes.
Yes. Now you can see options of the screens which you can share.
Yes.
And you can just select the one.
Yeah, I have selected my slide.
Okay. So
I think so. Instead of wasting more time, maybe I can go with this also, because I can increase the.
Okay, sir.
Isn't it?
Yes, sir. Okay.
If it is visible for everybody, I think so it is.
Yes, sir. It is visible only. Can you just reduce the size a little bit? Because I think so on top, the logos are cutting.
I can do it. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Thank you very much to the organizer, and specifically the session chairman, my good friend Dr. Karthik. Thank you very much for that introduction. Today I'll be talking a little bit about the deep sea benthic biodiversity and its implication to the deep sea mining. Specifically, I'll talk about these implications. We all know, how is the scenario globally about the deep sea research, particularly marine biology deep sea research. And with that background, we can see it that roughly around 50% of the ocean comes under the deep sea, which is more than 3,000 meter depth. Okay, as we all know, 70% is Earth's surface is covered by the sea, and 50% of the ocean itself is coming under the deep sea. Average depth of the deep sea is around 3.8 meter or 3.8 kilometer, 3,800 meters. However, if you look at from the study point of view, particularly marine biology study point of view, and that to deep sea biodiversity studies, if you look at it,
Abhishek, we've lost his.
I'm talking. Somebody just mentioned something, so that's what I was. If you look at it, only 5% of the 50% of the deep sea region, what we know it is, only 5% of the area has been sampled using the gadgets such as the remotely operated, different type of instruments, and less than 0.0001% have been sampled physically. So that is the situation globally as far as the deep sea research and biodiversity research are there. How about Indian Ocean? If you look at it, I'm just talking about deep sea Indian Ocean here. And as you can see that India is here, we have Bay of Bengal, this is the Arabian Sea, this is the mid-ocean ridge, it is the Central Indian Ocean Basin, you have Andaman, Back Basin. So Indian Ocean, looking at the general topographic point of view, has a mid-ocean spreading centers comprising over 18,000 kilometers. This is what it is, where we have it here, northern side Carlsberg Ridge, here is the Central Indian Ridge, Southwest Indian Ridge, Southeast Indian Ridge, and this is the basin what we have. This is the 90 degrees ridge there. So this comprises over 28% of global mid-ocean ridge areas. Recent studies have indicated that over 11 active hydrothermal vents, these are stars, red stars here, have been identified. Those are active hydrothermal vents. There are dozens of inactive, and still studies are going on. This is the world's largest, and Indian Ocean is the world's second largest area where we have got high grade manganese nodules are there. So mid-ocean region is one of the area where we have got huge potential of the mining, particularly hydrothermal sulfide. This is the basin area, which is the second largest, richest area in terms of the nodule deposits, polymetallic nodule deposits in the world, and that is in the Central Indian Basin. So two areas where we have got the potential of the mining, and there is a third, which is Bay of Bengal, which has been identified as a potential for the gas hydrate. So these, looking at the future commercial potentials of this area. So I'm just focusing on three of these areas, and particularly its implication in future from the biodiversity point of view. So in last 40 years of exploration, people have globally identified 90 active hydrothermal vents on the mid-ocean ridges. In Indian Ocean, there are 11. In fact, more than 500 new species have been identified with directly related to the hydrothermal vent, because these are the specific areas, and endemicity is very high in the hydrothermal vent. Now these three areas where I am focusing today is Bengal, where is you have a gas hydrate, the Central Indian Ocean, you have mineral polymetallic nodule deposit, and then the ridge system where we have the hydrothermal sulfides. However, if you look at it, the first slide where I was mentioning about global scenarios, Indian Ocean is amongst the biologically least sampled region compared to all other deep sea areas. So this is the situation. So my outline is something like this: deep sea environment and ecological habitats, deep sea biodiversity, which I already talked about a little bit about environment and habitat, biodiversity specifically in the 3 zones: Arabian Sea, Bay of Bengal, and the Indian Ocean, deep Indian Ocean, that include the nodal province area is the CIOB, Central Indian Ocean Basin, and Mid-Ocean Ridge, where the massive sulfides are there. And then finally, I'll discuss a little bit about the environmental impact assessment. Just for the common man's perspective, I thought I'll just give you about the benthic organisms. All the benthic organisms from the microscopic to the mega size are divided based on the size groups, and they are the microbenthic, which are mostly the larval stages of meo and macrofauna. And then we have the meofauna, which is between 500 to 50 to 500 micron. Then macrofauna, and then you have the megafauna, which is more than 3 centimeters. So these are the generally 4 categories which benthic ecologists are studying, and just for the facilitate the detailed study, those size groups have been there. And in the Indian Ocean for last almost 4 decades, we have been working, National Institute of Oceanography, and now also added with the NIOT and National Polar and Ocean Research Center, with their respective vessels, are sampling deep sea areas from under the different project umbrella. Most of the deep sea gears what we have been using are the box core, multi-core, grabs, dredges, beam trawls, depending upon the habitat, sedimentary habitat or benthic habitat. So if it is rocky areas, maybe dredge or the trawls are better suited, or if it is sedimentary subsediment, then maybe you can use the grab or box core or multi-core. These are the subsampling is conducted using different type of, again, either quadrant or the cores, and then they divide it, section it as per the requirement of different groups. For example, as I was talking about the benthic, different group, micro, neo, macro, and mega, and depending on that, the sectioning or subsampling will be done. And then most of the time we process the samples, benthic samples on board, because there is a huge quantity of sediment need to be sieved, and bringing back and again doing in a laboratory work is very tedious and time consuming. So sometimes pre-processing we do it on the ship itself, as and when possible. The meofaunal composition usually, as we have in the deep sea, we do get the groups very high diversity. Maybe density is less, but diversity is sometimes very high. And the common groups, as we can see, that there are the polychaetes, mostly larval stages I'm talking about: nematode, helicarid, tanids, amphipods, isopod, gastropod, herpetocoids. You have different type of other forms. And in terms of dominance in the deep sea, particularly sedimentary habitats, you mostly have polychaetes, crustaceans are the dominant one. And then you have nematodes. We do get it occasionally, these groups, but most of the time nematodes are very dominant. As far as macrofauna is concerned, again, you do have it. Most dominant are crustaceans and polychaetes. And you do have other groups, what we can see it, such as the echurids, echinoderms, oligochaetes, and mollusks in the deep sea. Okay, just for the benefit of the viewers, I thought I'll just give an overview of the Indian coast, how it is there, and then we move the EEZ. We recently did one study about the mostly what type of sedimentary habitats are there, soft sediment point of view along the Indian coast. And here are some of those areas, sedimentary habitats and the associated macrofauna with this. Basically macrofauna we did it. And as you can see that from the Gujarat to the West Bengal coast. These are some of those sedimentary basins identified based on the sediment characteristics. So starting from the Kutch basin, then we have Mumbai basin, Konkan region, then Kerala basin, then Kerala Lakshadweep area, then we have Kaveri basin, Krishna Godavari basin, and then we have the Mahanadi basin in the Bay of Bengal, and finally the Andaman Nicobar area. And if you look at the overall diversity with respect to the these basins, here are the number of species with respect to the different groups, major groups, polychaetes, gastropod, and bivalves. How they are distributed along these basins are just presented here. And if you look at it, about these three most dominant, we have somewhere around 1,400 species of the gastropods belong to 142 families, around 500 genera, bivalves, more than 582 species belong to 57 families, and polychaetes, roughly today it is more than 600 polychaete species belong to or something like 55 families. So this is how over the Indian coast within the EEZ the data was just pulled. I thought I will just present it how it is there in the soft sediment. Within that, we do have it some areas, both east coast and west coast, starting from the shallow water to the deep region, which are pockets of concern, and it is concerned from the environmental habitat point of view. That's what I was supposed to talk, as I mentioned it, that both the east coast and west coast, we have a huge area under the influence of the oxygen minimum zone, and that area is expanding towards the shallow water, which was earlier more in the deeper regions, but it is with the changing environment, it is even seasonally expanding to the shallow water, and it has got very huge repercussions on the commercial fishery specifically. And with that respect, we did some study how the benthic community responds to this oxygen minimum zone. Both on east and west coast studies have been done, both by National Institute of Oceanography and also by CMLRE, conducted under the CMLRE's program, and they have very good publications they came out. And this is an example, one of the transit we did it in somewhere in 2004-5, which was published in 2010, and subsequently recently also from the NIO they have published some good data which suggests that if you look at from shallow water to deeper water, here is a transit shown it here for shallow water around 25 meters to 3,000, more than 3,000 meters, and how it is divided. It is something like we have shelf region, slope region, and the basin region. And here is the area between 200 to 1,400 meter, 1,500 meter, which is the influence of the oxygen minimum zone is there in this area, and how the density and biomass of macrofauna varies here. You have the highest density in the shelf region, that is this region, which varied something like it was around 3,700 individuals per meter square. That was the highest, and lowest was 326 individual per meter square. That was in the basin region. So in the basin region, lowest, highest in the biomass, more or less also followed the similar trend, but we had higher biomass in the OMG, and this is not a surprise because OMG, although you have the less abundance, the organisms in this region are adapted to this particular, and they have quite a big size. And this has been recently published with respect to the megafauna, particularly with respect to the sea urchins present in the OMG areas. They are very abundant in that area, specific group, and they and other like Brita star and sea urchin, which has higher abundance and biomass. So this is how, one is very important thing. Recently, Dr. Sautia from National Institute of Oceanography have published. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Actually, you just have another minute or two left.
Oh, sure. I will. Yeah. I will try to finish it. So they have recently came out with very interesting data about the meiofauna and its size fraction with respect to the oxygen availability. We earlier have published with the, specifically on the nematodes and how they are adapted to the oxygen minimum zone. And these are some of the adaptations. Now coming to the cold seep region, and I last almost 10 years have been working on the about the cold seeps and gas hydrate region, and then they found out a few locations where you have the active gas hydrate zones are there and seepage is there. They studied it, very interesting fauna. They have got it in recently 2000 and 2019, 2021 also they have published some recent papers, and they showed it that there are some habitats, there are some areas where you have got rich molluscan and crustacean and echinodon diversity in this region. Detailed studies are yet to be completed. As far as the polymetallic nodule is there, in the CIB we have studied in last almost 30 years. Third is the hydrothermal sulfide, again in the rich or the mid-ocean rich region where we have active zone. I have already told that 11 active habitats have been identified. We recently have been doing the detailed study of some of those inactive zones from the inactive zones, specifically looking at the resources both from the living and non-living resources, and we have found very high abundance of some of those groups, which I will just go a little bit faster. Yes, some of the groups are the sponges, for example, megafauna. So with respect to the habitats, how is the diversity and abundance of megafauna it is there, and we found corals at the depth of around 3000 meter, bigger size of sponges, then crustaceans, different type of, and there are good amount of new species. In fact, so far what we have identified, and it has been published from Pacific, that whatever you are going to collect from this abyssal deep sea regions, particularly mid-ocean region areas, not only the hydrothermal vent active zone, but inactive zones, over 50% new species possibilities there. We have identified over half a dozen new species in the last 1 year, and much more are to be. These are some of those new species. These are vent specific species which are endemic to the vent of the Indian Ocean. You can see that there are crustaceans, crabs, there are shrimps, there are barnacles, and then there are some mollusks, both gastropod and mollusks, and they have shown very good genetic affiliation with the cold seep environment. As far as environmental impact assessment is concerned, which we did it in NIO and which is continuing at NIO, which shows that at the nodal province we did the study, and which it was basically to assess what could be the impact of commercial mining in future. And it showed that if you do the any disturbance at abyssal deep sea sedimentary region, there was almost 40% of reduction both in terms of density and biomass on the disturbance zone compared to the control zone. And therefore, although the recovery which we assessed it have been shown it's steady but slow recovery is there, but immediate impact is alarming, and we have to take care of when we are looking at the developing the technology. These aspects should be looked at very carefully. Yesterday, Dr. Ramdasan has already presented the technology development, and these are some of the input points for the technology development which we have been providing to the technology developers. I think so. This is my last slide. Thank you very much. But before that, I just want to give a messaging. This is recently published in the Nature, and which shows that when we are looking for the climate change situation globally, people are talking about some climate change's impact on the biodiversity. We need to protect the deep sea more, because as compared to any other thing, the trawling in the deep sea are more harming the benthic biodiversity than the climate change. This is the message which is published recently in the Science. Thank you very much, Dr. Karthik. I'm sorry if I have just taken a little bit more time.
No problem. Thank you, Dr. Ningulay. That's really a massive body of work, and you gave us a quick glimpse into that and some interesting messages at the end as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. Next is my talk, and I shall, Rohan or Abhishek, what was the strategy that you suggested? Once you go into full screen mode, how do I then find the share screen button or menu?
So Karthik, are you using a Mac?
Yep.
So if you go into presentation mode first, then you click on share screen, you should be able to use Command and Tab to switch to the window that has your presentation. There'll be two windows for PowerPoint. One of them will be the presentation, one of them will be your regular workspace. So choose the presentation itself. You'll see it as a full screen.
Hang on, let me see that. Oh yeah, hang on. No. No, that didn't do it. It's all right. Have the additional glitch of an external monitor that doesn't like some web platforms.
Yeah, that can be a problem. Yes.
Web platforms better than others. All right, let me just do this the brute force way. Okay, so can everybody see my screen now?
Yeah, it is visible.
Okay, well, at least I managed to minimize the window to the right, and so you should be able to follow much of the text in the slides. So my talk today is going to be a little bit different. I think we've heard some remarkable research presented from various parts of India and the Indian Ocean, and I'm going to be focusing more on a series of projects that have been initiated that may give that I'm hoping to provide this audience with a glimpse of the different sorts of collaborations that are already underway and maybe create ground for new collaborations in the future. So relatively little of this is going to focus on my own work. I will get started with that. So much of the work that I'm presenting today is certainly some of the results are part of a collaborative project that involve faculty from the Indian Institute of Science and Reduction Foundation. That's sort of more specific to some of the results that we'll present, but I'll also sort of present that broad overview of project that I talked about. Now, over the last 10, 15 years, work done by NIO, work done by Dr. Athol has brought to light not just the importance of this particular region for reefs and marine biodiversity, but also the threats that these reefs face. There have been numerous global studies and global analyses and publications, but some of the work that our colleagues have done have brought to light the particularly severe threats that our reefs face in both along the mainland coast as well as in the islands. And with that sort of background that we've all grappled with over this period, we initiated a series of projects or initiatives or programs in the Andaman Islands. And this involves a large range of collaborating institutions, both from India as well as abroad. The Andaman Islands themselves are an archipelago that lie on the Andaman Ridge that are part of the Arakan-Yoma mountain range and comprise the largest islands in the north, middle, and south, and an isolated little Andaman Island. They are part of an exceptionally diverse global biodiversity hotspot, the Indo-Burma, which the Andamans group are part of, and Sundaland, which the Nicobar group are part of. And in the Andamans, there are over 300 named islands, including several sanctuaries, national parks, and marine national parks. Specifically to the Andamans, they've also been subjected to a range of activities. I will not call them necessarily, I won't characterize them as threats to begin with, but they've been subject to activities which have had negative ecological impacts. There's been unregulated fisheries that has resulted in impacts on apex predators. We don't know what the downstream effects of these are. But in addition to the ecological impacts and the local mechanism, there's also the context, which is the local social context, which is a high dependency on marine resources, diverse social, economic, and cultural scenarios, settler versus tribal versus commercial communities, the market forces, and complex local and state governance mechanisms. So a few years ago, very broadly, we created a framework to study the social ecological systems of the Andaman Islands. And the way we characterized it is that we're dealing with human natural property marine ecosystems that are affected by a range of local stressors, primarily fishing, as well as global processes such as climate change. And our mandate here was to sort of understand the social, cultural, and economic aspects of resource extraction, and on the one hand, ecological processes and functions on the other. Within both of these, there were both top-down and bottom-up effects. All of understanding these processes could lead to better resource management and conservation planning, which would ensure the long-term survival of the Andaman Islands in particular, but marine ecosystems of the Indian Ocean more broadly. Now, this is a nice grand plan, and of course, in reality, no plan is ever sort of executed in this perfect idealistic way. In fact, many years ago, Rohan and I were part of a proposal together that actually framed it in this manner, and as many of you are familiar, such proposals never do get funded. But what did get funded was a series of projects that touch upon these in one way or the other. The main ones that we're currently working on fall under three categories. One is an interdisciplinary project at the Indian Institute of Science that I'll elaborate on in a bit. The second is a long-term ecological observatories project that is a national project endorsed and supported by the Ministry of Environment, Forest, and Climate Change. And the third is a global collaborative project on automated reef monitoring structures. And I'll dwell upon each of these briefly. Our project at IISc sort of aims to basically develop and expand on that framework that I presented in stages as funding becomes available. However, really the goal of the seed grant that we received was to bring a set of collaborators together from multiple different expertises. And so we have several ecologists, physical oceanographers from the Center for Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences, as well as computer scientists and chemical oceanographers from Earth Sciences. And we've been working together essentially at this point to set up a system of data collection across all of these different axes that we can then use going forward to slowly start addressing these different questions that we outlined at the outset. So very much a work in progress, and at this point, the project has pretty much only been seeded to begin developing more detailed ideas about this collaboration. The long-term ecological observatories project, of which the marine theme is led by the Dakshin Foundation and Dr. Ravi Nambudri, involves several scientists from multiple different institutions, including Dr. Rohan Athol, who's present here, and this particular project aims to study reefs, reef fish, seagrass ecosystems, sea turtles, and water quality. These were the critical ecosystems and critical taxa that were identified as for long-term monitoring. The support from the ministry is in 5-year cycles, but is intended to continue for a long time. And essentially, this is along with other terrestrial fauna and habitats, is intended to monitor these changes in the context of climate change. More broadly, we also initiated the monitoring of reef-associated organisms as part of a global collaborative with, which is an initiative that was started by the Smithsonian Institution. Our own project was set up in collaboration with Hong Kong University, and I'll present a few results from that. And all of these, in a sense, is towards, and I wanted to specify that it's both towards systematic conservation planning, with spatially implicit and explicit approaches. But on the one hand, the conservation of biodiversity and ecosystems, but also on the other hand, on the sustainable management of resources, and the use of data and technology to drive, to have informed data-based decision-making and policy-making with regard to the use of those resources. I'm going to speak very briefly about the progress that we've made on a few of these projects. We deployed about 12 arms units in February 2020. That's what they looked like at the beginning, all beautiful and clean and lovely. And that's what they look like a year later, all mucky but wonderfully full of organisms. Essentially, this is the protocol was set up for a standardized technique for censusing reef-associated biodiversity at a global scale. It's an approach that integrates traditional taxonomy with advanced molecular techniques such as DNA barcoding, meta barcoding, and NGS. Essentially, it's a PVC device that mimics a reef matrix, and it's colonized by sessile as well as motile fauna. We use direct identification, photographic analysis, and also eventually, genomic analysis, genetic and genomic analysis, all of the organisms that settle on it, which involves scraping the plates, making mixing it all, grinding it all up, and then running molecular analysis. These are some of the plates and some of the fauna from the first plates that we recovered, and we're in the process of initiating meta barcoding of these samples. As part of the reef monitoring, we're also using a whole range of traditional methods, but one of the, again, a sort of novel for us method that we've introduced is the baited remote underwater surveys. We standardized the equipment and the protocol last year, and we're hoping to sort of deploy these and collect some preliminary data in the coming season. What we did do in the last year, and this is partly because of the limitations imposed by COVID, some of the work that was planned along, actually many of these projects, including the long-term ecological observatories, could not really take off because of COVID-related travel constraints. So a part of our team has been working on species distribution models. We also have, as part of our project at the Indian Institute of Science, we have the physical oceanographers and computer scientists have also generated ocean models that are showing some really interesting results. I won't be able to present them today for lack of time, but I do have some results from our species distribution models, which aim to identify environmental correlates of reef fish distribution and model future distribution in response to climate change. What these essentially do is overlay field records on maps of the environment and use statistical models to generate maps of probability of where the species is present, and we can do that for the current day, and we can do that for the future, the past, or the future. And this is essentially done by determining a response variable for each species, for each response curve for each species for a particular environmental variable. So the relationship between that species and the environment, and then across multiple variables, is combined to generate these predictive maps. Across the 5 species that we initially targeted, you can see here that there's a fairly strong pattern in terms of bathymetry being a strong, an important variable for prediction for all of these species. Other variables such as primary productivity and phosphate and oceanographic variables. such as surface temperature and current velocity, were also found to be important for different species. And the kind of the results that you get are essentially on the left of each of these, you have the response curves, which you can examine for the relationship between the environmental variable and the species presence. Generate species distribution maps for, in this case, the checkered snapper. And these are maps for the present, and we can generate maps for the future and look at the change in distribution as influenced by climate change, which is our next goal. And similarly for the striped surgeonfish and the peacock kind. And these comparisons allow us to then infer what the impacts of climate change on both individual species as well as communities might be. So in summary, these are a set of projects that across institutions and experts across the country, as well as other collaborators, are intended to for the long-term monitoring of these towards the impacts of assess the impacts of climate and other stressors. We're looking at multiple target groups. We're really stressing on interdisciplinary approaches, sort of bringing ecology and oceanography together. We're piloting and experimenting with multiple new methods, and of course, all of this is towards the conservation, prioritization, and sustainable use and management of resources. One of the new projects, in fact, Dr. Kettle Houston and I have another new project that brings together the work that we've done on the mainland coast, brings that to the islands through support from CFIPRA. So acknowledging CFIPRA there for supporting this work going forward. And that's it from me. Thank you. I will stop sharing my screen, and as we've done for the previous presentations, we will go forward in the interest of time. Our next speaker is Javier Carton, and Javier is a physical oceanographer and works on a range of physical oceanography, including, I believe, flow dynamics, and today he will be talking to us about eddy dynamics in the Arabian Sea.
Okay, thank you very much. I report here about the work of a team composed of several researchers and PhD students. And so, firstly, I will briefly recall the observations that we had in the Arabian Sea and Northwestern Indian Ocean. Obviously, we all know the wind regime in this area, leading to a general circulation with coastal currents that reverses direction. And there is a great importance, in fact, of the mesoscale variability in this region, and a lot of eddies, which have been studied both by in situ measurements and by the altimetric measurements. And so we now have means with altimetric measurements to follow the eddies and to characterize them in the altimetric maps. So we have here an altimetric map with all the eddies which have been detected and that we can follow in time. And so we can see that both there are eddies in the marginal seas, like the here the Gulf of Oman here, and the Gulf of Aden here. And in the Gulf of Oman, there are two characteristic eddies. One in May that we don't see on this picture, which is a cyclone and an anticyclone near this cape. And in summer, there is a cyclone and an anticyclone along near this cape. During the year in the Gulf of Aden, there are eddies which propagate across the Gulf of Aden, which are formed at the mouth and then enter the Gulf of Aden. So this propagation is more clearly seen on this plot. This is a plot of distance in the Gulf of Aden, so along Gulf distance, and time. So we have here January to December. And we see that the eddies propagate progressively into the Gulf. And we can see a cross-section here, a vertical cross-section of the velocity of the eddies. And we can see very characteristic section of both velocities and isopycnal deviation. So that's very, very clear. So we had also a numerical model, a model that was a primitive equation that was HICOM, and that was a regional model, plus another model which was ROMS. and which was used for studies of specific cases. So for instance, using ROMs, we mimicked the position of eddies in a gulf, like the Gulf of Aden or the Gulf of Oman. So we reproduced with analytical means a chain of eddies, which are alternate eddies, like a cyclone, an anticyclone, a cyclone, an anticyclone, and so on. And we wanted to know what was the interaction of these eddies with the north and southern boundary of the Gulf. So here you have an upper view of the situation, so a view from the surface, and here you have a cross section of the Gulf along the dashed lines. And the time evolution is very much dependent on the fact that there is friction of these eddies on the boundaries. If there is no friction of these eddies on the boundaries, you produce very few little eddies and very few filaments. On the contrary, if you have friction, the friction of the eddies, of the major eddies, the mesoscale eddies, produces small eddies and filaments. And in fact, the fact that you have a cape like the Ras Al Amra Cape or other capes in these gulfs, it's not really important. The cape is just going to help the detachment of the small eddies, but not do more than that. So the eddies will be located here, small eddies will be located here and detached from here, but it's not going to help the process. The process is really based on lateral friction or bottom friction on the sloping side. And so this is the key to the formation of these very small eddies. Why do we study these very small eddies? Because they are very important for biology, because they are small, they are very nonlinear, and they are accompanied by long filaments, so that the vertical velocities accompanied, which correspond to these small eddies, are much larger than the vertical velocities corresponding to the big eddies. So the small eddies are really vertical pumps like the filaments. So very important for biology. Okay, so we have here what I just explained, that is the friction along a sloping bottom. And it's really this mechanism of friction along a sloping bottom on the side, which produces the small eddies. Then we could say, okay, these small eddies, it's very nice to see that you form them, but in fact, they are very small, and there is a big deformation rate of the big eddies. The big eddies are going to destroy the small eddies, and so why should we study them? Because they are going to disappear very fast. And in fact, that's not the case. Yeah, that's what we thought originally, indeed, but that's not the case. And why? Because in fact, you do not form a single small eddy, but you form a chain of small eddies. That can be seen, for instance, on this plot, where you can see that you form 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 small eddies. And then what happens is that the small eddies merge, they coalesce together. And so progressively, they get bigger and bigger, and so they resist the deformation by the big eddies. We calculated via very simple calculations the lifetime of small eddies if they did not merge. That would be just a few days. Well, when they merge and form bigger eddies, bigger nonlinear eddies, then they can resist up to 3 months, which is completely different. And the consequence of this, and we've studied it, is that the small eddies, since they get very strong, very nonlinear and bigger, they are able to trap water and to take it out of the gulfs. And so they participate in the exchange of water, both between the marginal gulfs, the Gulf of Oman and Gulf of Aden, and the Indian Ocean. And secondly, they also participate in the exchange of water between the coast and the deep ocean. So let me show you a few more results. This is what happens when you put a tracer here. So you put a tracer next to the coast, okay, and the tracer is then entrained into a small eddy. And same thing here. So they rotate, the small eddies rotate around the big eddies, but then the tracer remains really in the small eddies. So let me show you that these eddies, in fact, have a reality. We went to sea and we made measurements along the sea, the coast of the Sultanate of Oman, and the sections which are perpendicular to the coast here, in particular the red section and the blue section that you see here in temperature and salinity, they clearly show, in fact, that you have small eddies which take away the salty water which flows along the coast. So this salty water comes out of the Persian Gulf, it flows along the coast, and the small eddies which form and detach from the coast, they take this salty water away. Yeah, and so these are two more and three more proofs that you form small eddies. These proofs are given by the trajectories of Argo floats, and the trajectory of Argo floats, I'm going only to show this one. They clearly show that you form small eddies. You have small loops here in the big loops of the Argo float trajectories, and these small loops clearly correspond to temperature and salinity anomalies that we've seen on the vertical profiles. Then we've studied the coastal eddies using the ICOM model, and we've shown that indeed both in the Gulf of Oman that you see here and in the Gulf of Aden, there is the outflow of salty water from the Persian Gulf and the outflow of salty water from the Red Sea. And in both cases, you see the detachment in our model of small eddies as we saw them in our measurements at sea. So here you have a vertical section corresponding to the small area here, and you can see clearly that there is an eddy forming here, and there is an eddy which has already formed here. Here in the Gulf of Aden, you can clearly see the small eddy. So finally, we performed a simulation which was closer to the Gulf of Aden, with a strait here, a rift like the Tajura Rift, and a cape like the Cape of Berbera. And we let go the simulation. So we just let an outflow go into the Gulf, and we saw that this outflow would follow the coast as it does in reality. But then there are very strong so you see also the formation of the big eddies like the one here, but there are very strongly nonlinear processes here occurring near the Cape of Berbera, where many small fragments form, turbulence occurs, and small fragments form and detach from the Cape. So you can see them more clearly here in terms of velocity and rotation, so vorticity, where you see all the little fragments. Here you have a big eddy, but you have plenty of little eddies that form and detach here, and then they merge to form bigger eddies like this one. So finally, our conclusion is that the small eddies which form in the marginal gulfs of the northwestern Indian Ocean, they are not very rare occurrences, very rare events. They are very frequent events. They are not minor events because they can merge and they can grow in size and they can become more robust, and they play a role both in the export of the salty water from the marginal gulfs into the Indian Ocean and also from coastal water into the deep ocean. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Javier. That was great. So that brings us to the end of the talks for the session. And if I could request my fellow speakers to put their videos on again, I think we'd be happy to take questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, ideas. I think we have about roughly about 10 to 15 minutes for that. So the floor is open.
I'd like to ask a question to Xavier.
Yes.
Yeah. Would you say that, in fact, to reproduce correctly the transport in the Indian Ocean, we have to increase the spatial resolution? That is, and to which extent?
I think that if you reproduce the transport at large scale, especially coming from the open ocean towards the coast, the small eddies may not be really important. But what is really important in terms of more local transport, like the transport from the marginal seas into the open ocean, or the transport from the coast to the open ocean, then you really need to take into account these small eddies, because they really contribute a lot. Though they are small, they are many. In fact, they are very many. And so they contribute, I would say, perhaps to 30% of the transport from the coast to the open ocean. Obviously, you've got to take into account all the other phenomena like the filaments and everything that is already very well known.
Yes, but in terms of scale, then what's the minimum scale of these small eddies?
These simulations were so the simulation with the ICOM model was a 1 kilometer scale model of the whole Indian Ocean, and the simulations that you've seen with the ROMS model, the ROMS Croco, the one that you see on the screen for the moment, that's 250-meter resolution.
Thank you.
So that's not something that is available at a very large scale, so at planetary scale, obviously, and not even at the scale of a full ocean basin. So
but probably within the region, you were not there, but yesterday I presented some work on delineation of coastal provinces in which we would like to study connectivity. So within this area, it's important to downscale to this resolution.
I do believe that for connectivity, you really need to take into account the sub-mesoscale phenomena. I'm really strongly convinced of that. Yes.
Thank you.
It has been already shown by other authors in the northeastern Atlantic Ocean for connectivity between the Iberian Peninsula and the Azores current, because the mean flow goes in the opposite direction, goes from Azores to Iberia, and in fact the eddies, the small deep eddies, go the other way, and so they ensure the connectivity. So it has been shown.
Karthik, can I just get some clarification from Rohan?
Yes, please, of course.
Rohan, first of all, compliment very interesting and important studies your group have been doing it. I really want to compliment you on that. I intentionally did not put it in the chat box because I thought I'll get some time at the end to appreciate your work. Very good work. You have been doing it. Please continue it.
Thanks a lot, sir.
This is not a question. I don't know if there is any opportunity. I will be very happy to participate with you on the recovery process of the, what you have shown it very good, resilience of the Lakshadweep corals, about the recovery and resilience to the, particularly from the bleaching, but there certainly are human, pressures quite high in that, I believe so. What my question is, you have put up nice those cartoon about the parrotfish and its important, and maybe other fishes also. What are the interventions from government side for meeting those some of the challenges? Because as you rightly pointed out, fishing is the major economic activity, and that is how the social structures there is depend on fishery, other than if you see coconut and related little bit agriculture, but fishing is the major, and it is already shown decline, and therefore whatever the fish they are catching it, particularly reef and other side, it is not even consumed at locally. So if it is going directly for the international market, or at least the landward side, not at the island but mainland. So are there any intervention from either government, social, or the local as well as central government? And what are your view on that?
So that's a fascinating question, sir. And I think it's one of those problems that we, I think in the Lakshadweep, the people will have to try to handle. And whether we handle it from the perspective of the government or by working with local communities to self-regulate, I think it's something that we need to think about quite clearly. I mean, if you look at at least the near ecological history of the Lakshadweep, starting from the 1950s, 1960s, it's very clear, I think, what we can do about this. From the 1960s onwards, the Fisheries Department has done a really very good program to train local communities and also to subsidize fishing on pelagic fish. And while the kind of fishing that's taking place on pelagic fish is actually relatively sustainable, it's a pollen line fishing for a few species that are highly productive. Now, my sense is, and I think that we've been discussing this with Karthik and with several other people, that what is really required is a value addition of the fish that's caught pelagically. And if that happens, it would take pressure off the reef that is happening right now. What's happening right now, it's happening only in the last 4 or 5 years, well, a little bit more than 4 or 5 years, that people are finding that the pelagic fishery is no longer profitable. And as a result, they're latching onto opportunities coming from the mainland, where these boats are coming from the mainland with ice. And my feeling is that, fishermen see this reef fishing as only a secondary option. If they are able to make profits from the pelagic fish, by doing it in the way that they've been doing for the last 2 or 3 generations, I suspect that they would be very, very happy to move to that kind of fishery. So in terms of schemes for the fisheries department or for the government, I suspect that most of them should really be about value addition of pelagic fisheries and making sure that those are done sustainably. That would be, I think, very, very useful in the overall resilience of the reefs.
What about the putting of the artificial reefs and structures for attracting the pelagic fisheries and that type of interventions? Is there taker for that, or are there other thought about it?
I mean, there are other people on this call who'd probably be much, much better suited to answer a question like that. My personal, my personal feeling is that I think fish aggregation devices play a certain role when it comes to fish productivity, but also what that tends to happen often is that they run the risk of, really accelerating overfishing of these systems. And so I suspect that those are things that we'll need to think about a little bit more carefully. Also, the use of things like restoration, active restoration of coral reefs, etc. Those are, again, issues that I feel, while they're important, they're still fairly small in what they can potentially achieve at the scale at which at the scale of the destruction. We're talking about kilometers and kilometers of reefs being destroyed. I think that engineering solutions to restore them are still really only at their infancy. And before we can make that part of the arsenal of our toolbox, we really need to think of other kinds of habitat management solutions which will allow the natural potential of the reef to recover. And those are the kinds of things that I would like to see done much, much more.
Thank you. Thank you for your views.
Thanks, Rohan and Dr. Ningulay, for those questions. If there are any questions from our audience, that would be great. And also, if there are any thoughts or suggestions about the ways in which we could sort of leverage our associations and the Indo-French partnerships to, take research on marine biodiversity forward, that would be really valuable to hear.
Hello, sir. I have a few questions for Dr. Rohan. This is Dr. Manikandan from NIO.
Yes, please, go ahead.
Yeah, Rohan, sir, good evening. I'm so happy to see you after a long time.
Nice to see you.
Sir, yeah. So, Lakshadweep, like any other coastal reef, so far it doesn't have any designated national park kind of setup. And if you see the design of the national park, especially in coastal reefs like Gulf of Kutch or Gulf of Mannar, there's a very well designated zones like core zone, buffer zone, and transition zone. And the basic idea of having a core zone is to maintain it as like a no-take area, so that the fisheries exploitation in the buffer zone and transition zone will be like always like sustainable, and by the traditional methods fisheries are allowed. So what do you think such kind of setup is possible in Lakshadweep, to have the reef divided as like core zone, buffer zone, and to allow the traditional reef-based methods in a buffer and transition zone?
So yeah, Mani, I think that I think that the reserve areas can be a critical tool in trying to control fisheries. The difficulty is always one of compliance, and establishing a marine protected area is fairly easy. And in fact, some of the areas that are very isolated up in many of the areas up north are actually protected supposedly on paper right now. There are very large protected areas that have been established. The only problem is that, as in many of these instances, the ability to be able to monitor that or to actually enforce something like that is beyond the capacity of what we have right now. And it doesn't really make much sense, in my perspective, to be able to put these paper parks on. I mean, they will eventually be there on paper, but they will not really function. So in terms of, if you want to try and protect function as well as protect livelihoods, I don't think that that's really the solution. But I do think that working with local communities to restrict local fisheries, okay, using fisheries reserves and using things like territorial user rights, etc., they really are an important part of the, I think they're important lessons to learn, okay, from these, from this toolbox. But it's a very varied toolbox. I don't think we should think about the MPA as the only part of it. There are several others that we can think of that might work as effectively.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you. And I have one more question for Dr. Sonia Madam also.
Yes, Mani, go ahead.
Yes, madam. So you are talking about this functional traits and monitoring the ecosystems based on the functional perspectives. So you see that our traditional monitoring practices are so far largely based on the population abundance, diversity, and distribution. So what do you see as a challenge? And do you really think, is it possible to include the functional traits in our routine monitoring practices, like environmental impact assessment? And what are the challenges you foresee?
Yeah, that is a good question, actually. Obviously, there are advantages, which I was explaining in my slides, that why we should include functional traits as a portion in any environmental monitoring exercise. There are challenges because it takes a lot of man hours, a lot of efforts, a lot of information to be gathered regarding the traits. It's not easily available in many cases. But I think in the longer run, including molecular techniques, identification is taken care of faster. And probably with some kind of software developments, it could be incorporated in a better manner. It could be made much more user-friendly. That's what I think. But it has to be done in the longer run if you have to understand what exactly these benthos are doing in its environment. Just by learning the identity may not help us in the long run. This is what I think.
Because some of the recent literature are suggesting, even if there is loss of some particular species or a particular group of species, the ecosystems are still able to maintain their services.
Functional redundancy. Yeah.
Yes. So in that case, then I think in future, the monitoring practices should be focused more on using the functional traits than the structural based ones. So I hope the scientists like you should play a major role in it, in devising such monitoring plans. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Mani.
Yes.
Actually, in fact, I think several people have been driving in that direction. I can see Rohan smiling as well. I think people have been pushing very hard to monitor function here. I think we have time for one last question. Another young stalwart of marine research in India, Dr. Vardhan Patanka. I basically have time for a last question in our session or a last comment. Vardhan, you want to go ahead?
I just first want to say great presentation from all the speakers. It's really nice to know kind of work that is happening. I want to know presenters' perspective on 30 by 30 target, because it's more inclusive, or that's what it is shown, and essentially what it would mean to India's biodiversity, and what is your take on it? Karthik, if you can enlighten that, and especially this in the context of this conference, which is more collaborative between two government, I think it is something I would like to know your perspective. Thanks.
I'm not sure that all 3 days of this conference is enough to answer that question, actually, to be honest. It's quite a deep question in a sense. But if I may sort of take the liberty of answering that, I'm sure there are multiple perspectives between the speakers, but I want to hand over to our next session without delaying too much. I think essentially the answer to that is complex because it combines multiple axes, right? It combines the results that you would get from the ecological axis, the political efforts that are needed to make it happen, but perhaps most importantly, and what happens in all of these target scenarios are the consequences for the communities that sort of pay the cost of meeting these targets, right? And I think it's safe to say that from terrestrial conservation of the last 50 years, that the consequences of conservation or the consequences of meeting targets have been disproportionately borne by marginalized and vulnerable communities. So in a sense, I personally don't have an answer to your question, but I do think that, I mean, I'd really like to emphasize that when we're thinking about these targets in ecological terms, we really do have to think about all of the social, political and cultural and economic axes as well. And I think they're sometimes given short shrift in our considerations. So with that, I'll thank the organizers and my co-chairs again, and thanks everybody for attending and participating. Thank you very much. Blondie, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I think we don't have the time to make a break because some of our speakers can be with us after 6 o'clock. So that means that we will not be able to debate. So I prefer to go on right now without a break. So let me just quickly introduce to this session on the socio-economical transformation of coastal area. So despite the fact that coastal environments provide essential support and ecosystem services to a high density of population, and despite the fact marine and coastal ecosystem undergo unprecedented level of anthropogenic pressure, it remains still a challenge to integrate social science approaches into marine science and to take into account social dimension into marine and coastal policy and management. So the question of the present and the future of coast and maritime spaces is a growing issue and challenge in science, but also a complex one in the sense that a large number of factors and actors are involved. This deserves an interdisciplinary approach in order to be able to place these issues in an articulated and combined perspective in line with environmental, social, and also political challenges. This is a sense of this session with the will to put together different disciplines and see what can be done together. So for example, the project that will be presented by Julien Andrieux and Sadanand Sontake on the health of Indian mangrove articulates an approach based on botany, but also remote sensing and local ecological knowledge. Also, Marine Aldada will present an approach on at the crossroad of digital social research and science and technology studies on the digital construction of Indian Ocean. The blue economy is a subject of major attention for public scientific institutions, but also for NGOs. Indeed, these coastal areas concentrate high economical stakes due to the high density of population living there and investment of all kinds that line the coasts, but also fill the seas and ocean. They must be the subject of a particular attention in order to avoid the shortcomings of a development with deleterious environmental and social effects, which Parthasarathi will introduce to us. This is thus a cross-cutting issue of geopolitical nature. This is the meaning of this session, which aims both to report on scientific activities on these fragile spaces and their population and on our concerns. This is the address to our governmental authorities and should help them to reflect on the challenge of scientific programming. This research dynamic must not only be based on interdisciplinarity, but must also aim to take part in the public debate and support local players. Indeed, through their detailed understanding of local issue, they serve as relays for local initiatives. Research can serve as a mediator and interpreter of the issue of groups whose voices is not very influential in public policies. This is why we also wanted to include the point of view of NGOs in this session with the presentation of RT on democratizing maritime knowledge. Freddy de Souza also will take into account capacity building on small-scale fisheries in aquaculture. this issue is interdisciplinary, but also multiscalar. It goes beyond the local, regional, and national level. In this respect, the research dynamics to which we contribute involve inter-regional links with several states of the country and different countries with research groups abroad. As this is the case in the Fisher Coast project that Nicolas Botes and Ajit Menon will present and discuss. So then I would begin with this project of Fisher Coast. What I will ask you is to not try, but really keep to the timing because of we are already late, and also to put on your camera when you're speaking, and that's it. So Nicolas Botes, he's a researcher he was researcher at the French Institute of Pondicherry, and he's still affiliated, and he's also a professor at the Caen University. And he's as a geographer, his research focuses on urban dynamics, social movement, and dynamics of community heritage. And Ajit Menon is professor at the Madras Institute of Development Studies, interested in the political ecology and of conservation and development of coastal and forested landscape. So the voice is yours to present the coastal transformation and fisher well-being in Kodalur, Tamil Nadu.
Thank you, Blandine. Can you all see my screen?
Not yet, but I guess it's coming.
Hello? Okay. So I'll start speaking, and thanking you all for this opportunity to share with us some of the, and very briefly, aspects from the dynamic of research we tried to set up since 2019. That is a project called Fisher Coast, Coastal Transformation and Fishers Wellbeing. This project is funded through a consortium engaging ICSSR in India and ANR, the French National Agency for the French Institute of Pondicherry. It's coordinating by Ajit Menon. I'm speaking under his supervision, control. And we have along with us here, Partha, who is also part of the project, especially on the western coast of India. So the overall organization.
So Nicolas, did you share your screen? Because we don't see it.
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Okay, let me do it again.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. Then sorry. So, so the overall organization of the project is engage a consortium of 5 institutions and 20 scholars from social science specialists, anthropology, sociology, and geography, and people from ecology and marine science backgrounds. So we all tried to develop a combined analysis of the process interacting around 2 main field sites located in the district of Palghar and coordinated by Partha in Maharashtra and Kodalur in Tamil Nadu. So this process, which are shaping coastal localities in these 2 sites, are analyzed both separately as monographs and are submitted to a comparative approach through a kind of extended case study. While other issues studied by colleagues involved in case studies in Norway, Slovenia, and UK contribute to bring other perspectives from what we observe in India. So it's a kind of a double structuration of comparison, which is a challenge. So let me formulate the main questions around which this research is built before giving you some brief on the specific aspects we are working on, taking from the field conducted in Kodalur coastal villages. So how have government laws and investment policies reshaped the social ecology of the coast and therefore impacted fishers' livelihoods, socio-political organization, and also lived spaces? As a matter of fact, the changes faced by cultural coastal landscapes and societies since the middle of the 20th century are striking. Policies from different levels aiming at stimulating economic development continue to engage major industrial infrastructure in the coastal areas, leading to major changes especially in land use through land acquisition and in land cover also, while also stimulating the growth of the fishing industry, turning it more rationalized and more productive. Such policies and the overall political economy of the coast, followed by government institutions, along with natural hazards and more long-term environmental phenomena, have affected the coastal landscapes and their ecosystems from one side, and of course, the economy of fishing and the social world organized around this economy. So how have changes in fisheries, in the use of land and sea impacted labor practices, social routines, and imagination of the coast? I will try to give some ideas around that. How have fishers reacted individually and through collective actions to this transformation? And what finally we could say about fisher folks' well-being, considering that the concept or the idea of well-being goes far beyond economic conditions, allowing us to engage with multidimensional understanding of this idea. This is also a kind of a work in progress. So this research follows the ambition of deploying interdisciplinary approach in order to engage with the diversity of expression of these changes. Let me now briefly locate the district of Cuddalore. Before that, that's just a kind of, you see in the background of some very general elements. So let me go to the kind of locate the study, the case study I will briefly present and show you a map of the localities where the study cases are based from. And you see the animated series, thanks to Julien, of satellite images on the right, illustrate the dynamics of the coastal areas of the district over the last decades. So government laws and policies have implemented in both coastal land and shoreline specifically in different ways. So they could be organized into, divided into three types. One are the policies and schemes specific to the fisheries sector, as for example, the national and state fisheries policies, the last thing still being under approval, if I say there's a sixth draft of it by the end of 2020. So schemes also as, for example, Pradhan Mantri Matsya Sampada Yojana, which brings about the ambition of a blue revolution in the fisheries sector in India, which is also articulated with the CSS Blue Revolution Nil Kranti mission, aiming at, I'm quoting, promoting an integrated development and management of fisheries. Or, for example, funds like Fisheries and Aquaculture Infrastructure Development Funds. Second type of policies are investment policies formulated from the center, state, or at the sub-regional levels. That is policies of land acquisition, for example, stimulating industrial infrastructure or specific project, or funding aquaculture initiatives. The third type, relates to coastal environment policies specifically. The set of laws and regulation tools represent the backbone of the changes we are trying to explore. So coastal environment policies like the CRZ notification and the environment impact assessment notification. So let me share as a background some figures, general figures, which attest how the fisheries sector in Cuddalore has been changing over the last decades. In brief, the small-scale artisan fishers, once the major player in fisheries in Tamil Nadu, tends to be slowly replaced by a rapidly increasing mechanized sectors with new technologies, new techniques like trolling and ring seine, piercing, while the number of fishers are slowly declining, especially since the last 15 years. Production is increasing, as you see in the table of the catch representing today, around 100,000 tons more than it was 10 years ago. Thanks to the logics that drives the sector, facilitated by the state and accelerated after the 2004 tsunami, where influxes of money and investment largely turned a community economy into a dynamic capitalist sector. The major materialization of these changes is maybe the growing size and level of technology observed in the share of mechanized boats. This being now the major part of the fleet by around 78% in 2018 against 48 in 2005, according to NIFS. So I will now briefly go through three different expressions of the change we are trying to analyze and see how the remaining question of how to combine will remain. So along the fishing localities of Kardalo, the first major change is led by industrialization, by politics of industries. It reveals a rapid transition in the fisheries, the increased catch of the Indian oil sardine, especially in the eastern coast, rapidly transformed the livelihood of people, increased their revenues, and therefore opened opportunities to invest in education and improve their overall well-being. The growth of porcine fisheries also opened up to opportunity for non-fishers, especially Dalit men who work as laborers on these boats. This emerging economy of the sardine also increased the diversity of women engagement with fisheries-related works, both productive and reproductive, visible and invisible. However, non-fishermen have entered the fish selling business, create the situation of marginalizing women fish traders. More than it was the case, hierarchy and marginalization seems to work at its best. Among other effects, we observe a growing movement of migration towards urban centers from the villages of Kadalo to for new jobs opportunity, for education, and facilitated by family ties. We observe that from a village called Petodai to Chennai. One major aspect is the structural conflict generated by the industrialization of fishing. Pros and cons, ring scene, opposing artisanal fishers to ring scene and ring scene to trawling. A complex situation which can now be observed all along the Tamil Nadu coastline, which was very much, we observed very much concentrated around the villages in Kadalo Harbor, and which can be observed also all along the shorelines. Obstructions of fishing, fires among other acts of violence are revealing after are very strong after the states decided a ban on ring-sing fishing and continues to allow trawling at the environmental cost. Some people can study, are studying very precisely. So this is a very layered conflict. I don't have time to develop, but several of people of our team are involved in studying it closely through ethnography around the harbor. And I'll go to the second, oh, sorry, I forgot to put that, to the second driver of change. So the second driver of change, I can go back to that if you want after, is the incentive to industrialization of the coast, which reveal another scale of ongoing changes. So the scale and diversity of the projects of creating, establishing industries are striking. They are expressed by a series of industrial units being installed since the 1980s onward by SIPCOT, the State's Industry Promotion Corporation of Tamil Nadu, developed in three phases from 1984 onwards, leading to the establishments of several medium-sized chemical and pharmaceutical industries and a textile part. They lead directly to the acquisition of more than 2,000 acres of pristine coastal land, while 8,000 acres have been acquired since 2006 for an oil refinery, Nagarjuna, 3 thermal power plants, 1 shipbuilding yard, a textile processing unit, and 3 captive ports, among other infrastructure. This doesn't include the project of petrochemical and petroleum industrial regions, including several special economic zones and major units for export. And also, finally, the expansion of Kadalo Port under the Blue Economy scheme. So the effects are both economic and environmental. Another scale of industrialization happens in the promoting and expanding industries of aquaculture. There are also a kind of very major opposition at the local levels. Our team is involved in studying who is engaging, promoting, investing as entrepreneurs this aquaculture, and linking to the kind of fishing communities, because of course you see some investment coming from the fisheries sectors itself, even though the ambitions and environment and consequences could be a matter of reflection. So of course, all this has adverse effects on several types of industrialization, on livelihood and on environment, expressed or materialized by several kind of evidences. The land is a kind of major issues leading to a lot of expropriation, and what narratives report as a poor compensation. Of course, there are infringements of the common land used for fisheries and for fishing related activities. And the promises of development, also of industrialization generating employment, has been a kind of a deception among the people we met. And another kind of a side effect is the secondary activities, small cultivation, as cashew and cashewina, wood culture are disappearing to this for this land acquisition. So it's kind of mono specialization. And on environment, there is a kind of there are a set of effects which are testified in several places around close or more or less close from to the industries. So understanding these changes in fishing, in the major transformation generated by all these processes of industrializing fishing, industrialization as a planning strategy, has effect on land and sea in different ways. And this, to be clearly understood, it finally requires to go beyond the only expression of economy and environment. We are also then engaged in trying to see how people react. I discussed about that in the beginning. How do they feel about this, towards these changes? How change is locally perceived from one locality to another locality. Things are changing a lot. In order also to go beyond our role as a scholar, to maybe stimulate conscientization, create mediation or interrelation between a different kind of institution. Therefore, several study cases try to question how a succession of changes reveals forms of adaptation, opportunities also, and resistance to avoid what usually people refer to as resilience, which is a more complicated affair. And these movements involve more largely very specific expression of from the people related to what we refer to as imagination of being a fisher for the present and the future. What does it mean today due to these successive changes? What does it mean also in terms of practices, way of living, material culture? One such study case concerns collecting narratives of changes in artifacts, tools of fishing, techniques, and also knowledges for artisanal fishing. Another one records memory and yes, I'm finishing.
Let's need to conclude because you are already on your the time question.
Yeah, okay. Another one records memories and collect archives of the several natural hazards happening in the past in the coast, especially tsunami, its effect and on the coast, and the overall system that opened up at that time, which is one of the main breaking points of the political economy of the coast. To briefly conclude, there is an attempt, we are trying to be involved in an attempt to crisscrossing various disciplinary perspectives through, though we realize the strong internet connection between processes of changes, between climate events, physical changes in technology policy, and related social, economic, and political dynamics. There are many questions to be asked, and this this initiative, in a long-term perspective, we are therefore engaged in collective multiple data and build a permanent platform dedicated to coastal issues. This is ongoing. And this would hopefully strengthen collaboration between multiple institutions and groups involved in coastal marine sciences in order to disseminate, systematize, and articulate isolated studies and for understanding structurally what happened on the coast in India today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicolas. You already ate your time of questions. Maybe we take just one short question, but very short because we're supposed to switch to next presentation. Is there a short question? If there is not, unless Ajit want to add something?
No, I think, I mean, we can talk a lot more about it, but maybe at the end, if there's time for questions or more specific issues.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, then you will intervene in the discussion. So thanks a lot for this very rich presentation. And so now Dr. Parthasarathi from IIT Bombay, who is, so you are a sociologist. Your research interest is mainly on urban studies, development studies also, and law and governance, legal pluralism, vulnerability, disaster studies, many subjects. So I'll let you the floor to present on industries, infrastructure, and blue economy coastal transformation and contested development in the context of climate change. That will put the previous presentation in a wider context. And so you have 10, 12 minutes to present, and then we keep 5 minutes for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Blondin. Nicolas, you need to unshare so that I can start sharing my screen.
Oh, yes, okay. Done.
Yeah. All right, can you see my screen now?
Yeah, we see it. Thanks a lot. Perfect.
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me to this workshop, and I'm happy to be amidst colleagues whom I have not met physically because of the pandemic. At least get a chance to meet them virtually. So as Nicolas was saying earlier, I'm also part of the Fish Coast project, but since Dr. Blondin specifically requested that I focus on the broader context, as you just mentioned, of socioeconomic transformations and vulnerabilities of the Indian coast, and also try to imagine what we should pursue from a research thematic point of view. So I'm going to focus on mapping out some of the transformations, conflicts, and contestations around the Indian coast, and then not just bring out some themes for research, but also some analytical frameworks, conceptualizations, the ways in which there is response and resistance to the coastal transformation from fisher communities. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on. All right, so drawing essentially from the Fisher Coast project, but also an earlier project with Martin Bowing and Ajit Menon that we did in the same two districts in the east and west coast of India. These are some of the people I've worked with over the last 5-6 years and developed the perspectives that I'm presenting in this paper. And broadly inspired by the thinking about ocean grab and coastal squeeze, some initial very preliminary thinking about marine social sciences by problematizing the issue of the coast in India, and also something that I've been working on for many years with Martin, Ajit, and others on adopting a legal pluralism perspective on coastal contestations, especially looking at property rights and commons. All right, so let me begin with the a broad mapping of coastal transformation and coastal problematic, and I wish to emphasize here that I wish to focus as much on the anthropogenic impacts on the coast as on the climate change related impacts on coastal communities, especially the fishers. So we're caught in some kind of a squeeze, literally between the devil and the deep sea. So Marx, as most of us will know, compared capitalism to vampirism, to vampires, and we see a lack of sensitivity, a lot of stupidity, a lot of greed when it comes to projects along the Indian coast, which lead to encroachment on coastal commons, degradation of resources, decline of livelihoods, food security, and so on. And so maybe what we need is not marine social sciences, but Buffy the Vampire Slayer to come and solve the problem for us. But more seriously, if you look at the problems of coastal grab, ocean grab, coastal squeeze, and so on, which Bowing, Ponty, Bennett, everybody else, so all of these have talked about, essentially the focus is on different kinds of development projects, infrastructure, urbanization, blue economy, more recently security projects, all of which uh, uh, take away resources, livelihoods, encroach on commons, and deeply affect marine and coastal biodiversity across all the coastal states of India. And this is happening in a context where in India specifically, but around Asia, there is significant amount of coastal urbanization that's happening. And most of the densely populated, economically prosperous regions are located along the coasts in India and in Asia. At the same time, what we see is that this kind of coastal development is happening uh, uh, both in a context where there are very large number of original claimants, mainly fishing communities, making use of customary law to eke out livelihoods in coastal regions. And the new claimants come from industry, tourism, and so on. So the squeeze is being applied from the landward side by these new claimants, and from the seaward side also by the new claimants from the blue economy, from security, from deep sea mining, coastal marine energy projects, and so on, but also from climate change. Therefore, what is very important for us from the marine social sciences point of view is to remember that these are not greenfield projects, but happening in a context where there are a very significantly large number of populations hunting, gathering, foraging, both on land and sea in coastal areas. And therefore, the larger perspective that we require is one of how the geography of capital intersects with, as Nicola also showed, different kinds of fisher conflicts with fishers and non-fishers in against a background where there are specific kinds of identity-based groups living in these areas and which are increasingly being politicized also. And that's part of the understanding of the conflicts and contestation in coastal areas. If we need to look at the problem of ocean grab and coastal squeeze in the Indian context, it's not simply about describing these processes. The sheer scale and intensity is humongous, and it's unprecedented compared to the recent past of the country's history. So the changes are rapid, they're violent, and they're very intense. There's huge amounts of population migration, population densities. So we're dealing with issues of scale and intensity, which do not yield simple solutions, both in terms of how to manage the risks for these populations, but also managing their aspirations when we are talking about coastal conservation and sustainable development. And as I was saying earlier, this is happening in a context where there are enhanced risks from climate hazards, especially sea level rise, tropical storms and cyclones, and in our field area, earthquakes also are frequent. And we also see that attempts to mitigate climate change come with their own problems, where in the name of mitigating global warming, a lot of offshore projects, energy projects, which are also creating significant risks and leading to declining biodiversity and livelihoods for coastal populations. Okay? And we also have some of the climate proofing projects. The good example would be seawalls, which also come with their own problems because they try to arrest coastal erosion or sea level rise, but protect people from coastal inundation, but they just displace the problems elsewhere. And therefore, some of these also are quite problematic that we need to discuss when we look at the marine social sciences. And so we see that a lot of studies map cities at risk from sea level rise, and many of them are located in South Asian, in the Indian subcontinent. We also see that among the list of the top cities exposed to coastal flood risk, many of them are located in South and Southeast Asia. So against this background, a number of recent scholars have begun talking about how this present geological era of Anthropocene cannot be understood purely in terms of uh, uh, the anthropogenic impacts on the planet Earth. So obviously, the what is called as the deadly trio, global warming, declining oxygen levels, acidification, pose a significant threat to marine biodiversity. But as Donna Haraway shows, neoliberalism is only one part of the problem. So to understand the context of the changes, the conflicts, the contestations in coastal areas between small-scale fishers and state and capital, we need to also look into issues of history, of culture, what is a larger discourse of development, discourses around biodiversity, around climate change, around green energy, and so on, all of which come together to create particular kinds of problems and risks for resource-dependent communities that we primarily are interested in. And this is probably something that Aarti Sridhar will come to later, but there is an epistemological problem as well here, because standard ways of understanding ecosystems, environment, may or may not yield the desired results, because we're talking about things like intertidal zones and the blurred distinction between the sea and coast. And therefore, there are also very distinct notions and practices around property rights, around commons, around self-governance, customary laws, gender, which is very distinct when it comes to fishing communities, and the division of labor, which gives greater autonomy and empowerment, especially on monetary resources to women. And therefore, in thinking about agendas for social sciences in coastal zones in India, we need more interdisciplinary research to better understand the kind of environments, habitats, ecosystems that we're dealing with, and the related social relationships, institutions, and practices that occur in these areas. And this came out very well in one of the judgments of the National Green Tribunal, challenged by the fishers in the Mumbai metropolitan region in the village of Uran, who specifically brought up these issues when it came to compensation and how to deal with the destruction, the damage to the environment caused by port projects, new airport projects, and so on. And the National Green Tribunal specifically pointed out the complexity of looking at property rights and the ecological flows in thinking about more sustainable governance of these coastal areas. In the Indian context, there are a couple of other issues that were already flagged by Nicola, so I won't go into them in detail, but it's something that Aarti has worked on quite a lot also, that there is gross violation and frequent amendment to environmental laws such as the CRZ. We also see that the research on climate change coming from the global perspective tends to largely ignore the hydrometeorological disasters, which have a specific kind of uniqueness and distinctiveness when it comes to the Indian context. Again, that's not being adequately studied. We don't have enough models for this to have better predictions and strategies. So across India, across the coastal zones, there are, of course, shared risks, exposure to climate change hazards, and of course, anthropogenic encroachments, destructions due to a range of projects that I mentioned earlier. But we also see that all these different states, cities, coastal areas make the same kind of mistakes in not taking the coastal environment seriously enough, whether from the scientific and ecological perspective or the climate change perspective or from a more social science perspective. And that is where I think we have a clear agenda of coming together across different disciplines to see how, on the one hand, we can address these risks and challenges. On the other hand, see what we can do to ensure that we don't, get into the same kind of stupidities and mistakes that we've been committing for decade after decade.
Partha,
yeah.
Can you conclude if you want to keep time for at least one question?
Yeah. I'll just take 1 or 2 minutes and then I'll stop. So what do we do in terms of the marine social sciences? What are we talking about here? First is borrowing from this work of Baker, Rutten, and Rotterbaum. How do we look at coastal areas in terms of localities of value? Which are the communities which are involved in these conflicts and contestations? What are the issues of access? What kind of legal regimes exist? And how do we incorporate issues of ethnicity, caste, migrant status, gender into broader critiques of political ecology instead of taking political ecology for granted and simply borrowing from the forest context to the marine sphere. Also, I've suggested in another paper how we can look at small-scale fisheries as a method, because, and Arti will probably talk about it more, and I'm not going to focus on it here. There are very distinct debates around artisanal fishing, technology, scale related to boats, as well as gear, issues of commercialization, ethnicity, and all of these come together. And therefore, there's considerable historical discussion on what is called as a new thalassology of the ocean and the sea, especially around issues related to common property management, self-governance, how the social structure and social relationships of the fishes are very different from the agrarian social structure. At the same time, understanding that there is a lot of diversity across India and diversity also in the availability of data. So it's a challenge to put together an agenda for marine social sciences. There is also a significant amount of interest in pluralization of law, which comes both from the understanding of customary laws for governance by communities themselves, but also the pluralization that is happening due to frequent amendments, violations, and a lot of unscientific claims that get into laws, coastal conservation laws, from the state itself. And therefore, this kind of pluralization makes it much more challenging for us to think about the kind of conflicts and contestations that happen in the coastal areas, and how both civil society and NGOs, but also as academics, we can intervene in these debates. Yesterday, I was in a similar kind of workshop with about Indo-German collaborations, and one of the things we discussed was about the significance of legal petitions and conflicts when it comes to these coastal transformations, and that's something that's a very important issue that I would like to flag as well. And finally, I would like to end by talking about a couple of issues relating to climate change, where we have talked about uncertainty as a super wicked problem, where fishers particularly are affected by the very significant uncertainties arising from climate change, but also the inability to convert these climate change models into strategies which can be used effectively by fishers to address these kinds of risks. And this is also happening because the fishers in India largely belong to particular ethnic caste groups, increasingly migrant labor, and the discrimination by the rest of society and the neglect of this community by the state is part of the reason why the uncertainty of climate change results in particular kinds of injustices for these communities. And therefore, I would like to end with this fundamental question that while we all think we know who are the coastal ecosystem people in Asia, who are the fishers, but unpacking this, expanding this in terms of property rights, their exposure to climate risks, their relationship to power, these will enable us to set out a distinct set of themes for collaboration and for agendas for marine social sciences in the years to come in India. So let me stop here.
Thanks a lot, Partha. And sorry for asking you to conclude. We're also out of time for questions, but I know that you won't be able to stay at the end. So maybe if there is one question, we can a short question, we can take it before going on, unless this is very stimulating presentation, leave everybody without question or too many questions, maybe. Okay, I don't see a hand raising. Ben, thanks a lot. And I will leave now Marine Aldada to present her work. So Marine, you are a sociologist, a CNRS fellow, so from the French National Center for Scientific Research, and you're also in post at the French Institute of Pondicherry now. And your focus is on digital policies in Asia and Africa, and more particularly you're interested more in digital health in India, Ghana and Kenya. And so you will now present a project on Indian digital ocean. So time is yours now for 10-12 minutes, if you want to keep a few minutes for questions.
Okay, I will try to stick to the plan. Do you see my screen and hear me well?
Definitely.
Okay, good. Okay, good. So this project I'm going to present today, called the Indian Digital Ocean, or INDIGO, is in fact a project that will be submitted next January for the starting grant at the European Research Council. In fact, it starts from one idea, the fact that for decades, many social scientists have shown the intricacy of the environmental, commercial, and technical mechanisms at work in the shaping of the Indian Ocean world. However, the digital construction of the Indian Ocean world remains untraveled by social sciences. So the project INDIGO will undertake the first exploration of the ocean to understand what kind of Indian Ocean world digital technology is bringing into being. So one of the first thing that is striking, as you can see in this image, is the fact that the Indian Ocean is the only one in the world that the GAFAM didn't travel with their fiber optic cables. So the yellow cables, you can see the only ocean in the world is the western part of the Indian Ocean that has been untraveled by the GAFAM, so the big operator today of the digital, Google, Amazon, Facebook. They are all traveling around the other ocean, but not this one. And at the same time, India is their primary country of investment outside the United States. How come Singapore is the most connected place in the world? And how did Mauritius became a global destination for software outsourcing? How did the world's most widely used mobile money wallet emerge from the Swahili coast in Kenya? All these questions are part of this big project on the fact that the Indian Ocean is more than just a stimulating geography for digitalization. As the world's largest maritime space, it's a very strategic space for digital actors, which is tied together for centuries by global political, economic, and cultural issues. And the digital construction of this ocean is a big geopolitical issue now. So what are the questions of the project INDIGO? The project stems from two simple questions. The first one is, what are the structures, the actors, and the socio-technical processes that contribute to the digital construction of the Indian Ocean? And then the second one, what are the political, economic, and cultural dynamics that characterize such a digitalized social world? The goal of the project is so to analyze the material infrastructure together with the modalities of human action and being in an Indian Ocean world designed and produced by and through digital technology. INDIGO also seeks to identify both the structure and the dynamic that are at play in a very massive process that is called digitalization, while investigating the construction of specific digital powers in the Indian Ocean, countries that have long been seen as peripheral, like India, South Africa, and Kenya, and their interconnection with island markets that are today perceived as digital hubs, like Singapore, Sri Lanka, or Mauritius. To this end, the project posits two strong hypotheses around digitalization of the Indian Ocean. The first one is that digitalization has strengthened the foundational connections and circulation of the Indian Ocean world, but it brought with it a new form of political and economic imbalance that benefits the more technologically advanced countries of the Indian Ocean. And the second hypothesis is the fact that the historical influence of India in the region is being reinforced and extended by digitalization. So to work on these questions and hypotheses, Indigo is standing at the intersection between digital studies and social studies of science and technology. The project takes a genuinely interdisciplinary approach, drawing on several years of collaboration with colleagues from the field of sociology, geography, economics, history, anthropology, and political sciences, all working on digitalization. Digitalization is an ongoing and highly dynamic process resulting from particular choices, policies, coalitions, and economic constellation. It raises transnational issues because its financing, technical implementation, and infrastructure are all managed by different actors located around the globe. But it also has local features and specificities that depend on the context of deployment of digital infrastructures. So the project opts out to study several digital development sites at once, tracing their connections and identifying the nodes that link them together so as to understand the global forces and the local points of anchorage that characterize digitalization. The project will draw on multi-site investigation covering several digital initiatives rolled out across the Indian Ocean in India, Kenya, South Africa, Singapore, Mauritius, and Sri Lanka. Through a mix of participant observation, sociological qualitative interviews, and massive corpuses, Indigo's research design involves a combination of textometric, biographic, and ethnographic methods. Indigo will benefit from the support of reference team in the digital studies in France, but also worldwide with this international collaboration I have developed since 2015 as coordinator of the digital studies in the Global South group, and now the Digitization and Society in Asia and Africa network, which combines 11 labs in France, South Africa, Germany, India, Kenya, Nepal, and the Netherlands. These networks, as well as my other project, have enabled me to bring together social scientists to offer guidance and to be directly involved in this massive research. And as you can see on the map, there are also several French institutes involved in the project, whether in Delhi, in Pondicherry, in Kenya, or in South Africa. So the project is structured in 5 work objectives and challenges of a connected ocean. That's where the 5 objects are unpacking interrelated challenging dimension. The 2 first ones are focusing on the infrastructural and environmental challenges of a connected Indian Ocean. And the 3 subsequent ones are exploring the major domains of the social that are impacted by this connectivity through economic, political, and cultural dynamics and change. So the first work package looks at the hardware infrastructure of the digital age, cables, towers, data center that connect up the Indian Ocean, and at strategic points in the network, Chennai, Mumbai, Singapore, Port Louis, Mombasa, and Cape Town. It also explores a competing route, the digital Silk Road, linking China to Africa via Pakistan. While outwardly opposed to the digital Silk Road, India is nonetheless its leading recipient. So this first work package will analyze the geopolitical issues of control and dependencies around such digital highways. The second work package focuses at the maritime dimension of the Indian Ocean, because as the largest maritime space on the planet, the Indian Ocean is the setting for a race to digitalize the sea through maritime IT, particularly through smart port infrastructure projects. This work package is focusing on maritime IT in the Indian Ocean megaports and the forms of digitalization of coastal and marine life that it enables, and their consequences in terms of access to, monopolization of, or exclusion from maritime spaces and resources. The third work package seeks to understand the evolution of Indian Ocean economies by studying two recent major economic transformations brought about by digital technology. The first one is the formalization of money through demonetization programs to replace cash with virtual money, mainly stored and transferred using mobile wallets. And the second one is the Uberization of work, the formalization of the gig economy through the introduction of online service platforms. Work package 4 is focusing on the political challenges of digitalization in our datacratic era, which is supposedly based on the control and administration of digitized information and digitized individual. Aadhaar, the world's largest digital identification system, launched in 2009 by India, constitutes the gold standard for digital citizenship policies in the Indian Ocean, copycatted by Mauritius, Sri Lanka, and Kenya. This work objective analyzes India's biometric and e-populist government and the export of this model throughout the Indian Ocean. The last work package is focusing on cultural challenges. As you know already, 80% of internet traffic is based on streaming platforms and social networks. They occupy a very significant place in our lives. This platform promise to contribute to the democratization of access to culture, to the emergence of new talents, or even the revitalization of marginalized cultures. Major platforms have been challenged by the Indian Ocean's cultural landscape. Netflix faced massive protests in India and Kenya. TikTok was banned in India and had to redeploy its activities toward Kenya and South Africa. By looking at the way in which international digital operators compete today with the area's historical cultural actors, this work package will question new forms of cultural hegemony in the Indian Ocean that are brought by digital technologies. These 5 pillars of Indigo represent an examination of the specific conditions that have enabled digitalization to emerge and to take root in this specific space. The fundamental mechanism, the economic imperative, the modes of circulation, and the construction of power, as well as the principle of social and environmental organization, will be studied through this program. A project on the Indian Ocean transition to digital and the specific role of India in the transformation of this large maritime space addresses a new and especially relevant topic in this age of accelerating global digitalization. And I will be happy to discuss this project with you because normally I still have a bit of time. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Marine. And so we have 5 minutes to discuss and to discuss this a really wonderful project, and we cross fingers that you convince the ERC to fund it. So who wants to raise their hand to ask question or react to this presentation? And then put also the micro on and video on. Seems that there's many people, but yeah, Ajit Menon, and then Artika.
It's really fascinating. I found that fascinating, though I don't know anything much about it. I'm just curious as to why the Western Indian Ocean seems to be the area which has not been tapped with whatever fiber optic cables like other oceans. Is there any historical reason or political reason for that? Or?
Yes, so there are historical reason for sure, because in fact the fiber optic cable, as modern and contemporary they are, in fact they are following older routes, like for instance the telegraph routes and all, and so you have old actors of the telecommunication that are still around, but in fact new actors didn't go for this part of the world. And the major reason is one, because India is very present in this area. And for instance, Tata Reliance are both competing a lot in order to manage the traffic. And in fact, 1/4 of the world traffic goes through their cables. And in this region, they are the only one to wire all the African continent coming from Asia. So it's historical reason for sure. It's also because the GAFAM have before less interest in this region, but now today with the digitalization of both Africa and South Asia, these are the new markets. So now they are entering in, and they are going to be a great competition on this. So we'll see what will happen. But yes, it's both historical reason, like infrastructural one, because of the telegraph routes, for instance, but it's also geopolitical reason and the fact that the region was not of interest for the big digital players coming from the West.
Thanks a lot. Artist Rida, can you put your camera on when you speak? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Marine, great presentation. Just 2 quick questions. I was wondering whether, there might be other infrastructures of digitalization that are much more prominent in the Indian Ocean countries. And I don't know, these Google balloons and all these other things. It may not be the fiber optic cables as such. Whether that was part of mapping this infrastructure. And also, whether one of your work packages was examining how digitalization maybe interfaces with the marine sciences, because we've seen in the other projects, right, like it's very much dependent also on a lot of digital technologies. So I wonder if that was also part of the work packages. Thanks.
Thank you, Arti. For the first question around infrastructures, I chose the fiber optic cable and data centers because it gathers 99% of the internet traffic. But in fact, it would be also interesting to look at satellites because India has been involved a lot in major satellite connectivity, even if it's really a fraction of connectivity in the world. They have launched a satellite connection and connectivity for Africa. There is this big project of development through the Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs around giving connectivity to Africa through satellites. So I didn't plan at first sight to work on satellites because it's really a small fraction of it, but it could be also interesting to look at this. And the connection with marine science, of course, I think it's going to intersect with the work package on environmental issues because having a supervision and a control around digital tools of the ocean itself through Megaport or through embarked technology of track and tracing on boats is going to be connected with marine sciences. And I think at IFP we will work on this, how to connect the satellite visualization, but also new track and trace devices that are used in order to analyze the ocean. So yeah, it's gonna, for sure, it's gonna be part of the second work objective. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot. So maybe now we move to a quite different part of this session, leaving the blue economy and the digital development. And we were going to listen to Julien Andrieux, who is a geographer from the French Institute of Pondicherry, working in remote sensing with a special interest in mangrove. And also Sadanand Sontake, who is professor at the National Environment Engineering Research Institute in Nagpur, who is interested in biodiversity and wildlife conservation. So the floor is yours to present an Indian mangrove ecosystem health on the question if the restoration process is not hiding emerging threat.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me good? Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. So we will present with my colleagues on the new project of collaboration between France and India on the topic of mangroves. So let me introduce you briefly the ecosystem we're studying together. So mangroves are a forest in the sea, as we call them in the very short way. So an ecosystem very peculiar, just on tropical shorelands, on mud flats, bringing a large number of important ecosystem services And as a matter of fact, mangrove has become some kind of the example of ecosystem services, bringing regulations in terms of hydrology and climate, bringing support to population, bringing provision to coastal communities, bringing culture support. And on the other way, mangroves are knowing quite an important decline at global scale, with a loss in cover. If you take the big, large number at global scale, which are not always accurate in all means, so lost in 47,000 hectares every year for the 90s and 2000s. This kind of rate in decline has been lower, so we're going into more stable surfaces. But anyway, there is an important decline. The drivers of these changes can be very natural. Some of the main mangroves in the world are under natural dynamics, changing with sedimentations and erosions, or changes in the climate, which need not always the climate change, but other climatic cycles. And very important driver of change is aquaculture and other agriculture. And other drivers change not necessarily for mangrove loss, like afforestation and reforestation. And some newer topic we will talk more in depth with Andaman about pollution. So we have very different drivers according to the context, the continent, to the kind of mangroves. These drivers are often listed by science, but rarely measured and weighted. And most of these changes show that mangrove can be very strongly resilient. So even if I started with the decline, very probably this decline is not irreversible. So today, the science about mangrove is dealing with some scientific uncertainties in our ability to assess these dynamics and the state of mangroves. For example, if you take this graph in the upper left part about statistics in Thailand, this is an interesting paper from Reefs and Webb. We're trying to deal with uncertainties in the trend in changes in mangroves. And you can see that there is a half of the data, if you take long-term data going from the 60s until now, that show consistent in a quite slow decrease in the mangrove surfaces in Thailand. But there is another set of data coming from other publications and other methods. When you look at the trends between the 90s and now, you have a very strong increase in surfaces. This is typical, not robust data, so we have to take decision about conservation of the mangrove with data that is not accurate and that is not robust. Another example are the two maps down on the right and on the left. One was a publication about some mangroves in West Africa, and on the right it was a publication from me correcting a huge mistake, technical mistake in mapping of scientists from the United States describing a huge decline in mangrove that was going into a restoration process, a successful regeneration process. There is another uncertainty in terms of interpreting some changes, and one of the most interesting is about restoration and replantation of mangroves, which are done for blue carbon, most of it, and can be, for example, interpreted as a restoration or as a land grabbing, according if you take the carbon point of view or the well-being of populations point of view. So now our network is trying to inscribe mangrove studies into the sustainability science, which is a practical, problem-driven, interdisciplinary, and intersectorial science, trying to look at these questions with this point of view, like what I said about the restoration, trying to understand how it can be considered a greening or a land grabbing. And most of it, there is a quite strong network working to the question of finding a way to assure co-benefits of mangrove conservation for both the nature itself, for the mangrove, and for the local population. For example, understand in a sustainability science point of view, not a strictly ecological point of view, an overprotected mangrove where people, the local community don't have an access to resource is not a healthy socio-ecosystem. It can be a very well-preserved ecosystem, but if the well-being of population is being lowered by such an overprotection, can be seen as a problem. So now we'll talk about India a little bit. So Indian mangroves have some common features with the mangroves in the whole world, that it's very strongly protected. Just some interesting facts. Mangroves are the most protected ecosystem on Earth. If you take the percentage of the ecosystem under protected area status, it's the most protected ecosystem on Earth. It's protected mostly from local human activity. We protect mangroves from the local community, never from upstream pollution or for bad governance problem. And mangrove in India, as the rest of the world, is restored for its carbon storage mainly. And this is perceived by population as a resource gravity. From one, first we could say that Sundarbans are the biggest mangrove of the world. They are only part Indian, but anyway. And another thing that I believe is very interesting in my point of view, that mangrove in India has probably the highest rates of mangrove restoration in the world. The whole world, the countries with mangroves try to restore, to stop more carbon, and most of the countries are failing in restoring mangroves. I belong to some think tank led by friends who want to advise people, countries helping in restoring their mangrove, and they're failing in most of their projects. And when I arrived in India, I discovered that most of the restoration is really working very good. You can see in the graph down. Mangrove coverage in Gujarat, so the surfaces it has in the 80s. It has doubled in Tamil Nadu, so it's not a unique case. Mangrove in India is well restored. And on the same way, we have a severe pollution in general on the coast and the waters in India, but it's touching the mangrove in an important way. So you can find a lot of publications and number, and this pollution is a lot about heavy metals. So we wanted with Dr. Sadanand to present you the idea of a project, but there are more than one project. We already submitted two different projects together with various teams from India and from France. So the idea is this one. We have this success story in restoration, and we have important threats. Main of this one is the pollution. So how can we define what is a healthy social ecosystem where there is an overprotection, there is an efficient restoration, and some very not visible threats are entering into the system. To do that, we want to put together a set of sciences and disciplines or tools with local ecological knowledge and interviews with population to understand their perceptions of these changes and in the environment. Remote sensing, that is quite a powerful tool to map the changes in the environment, particularly in places where moving is not easy, like mangroves. But remote sensing by itself is never accurate enough, so it can be accompanied with a lot of biodiversity monitoring, both in botanical, check the mangrove itself, the rest of the ecosystem and the rest of the biodiversity, and that's the part that will be presented by my colleague. And we can link this biodiversity monitoring with some ecotoxicology about the heavy metal monitoring and trying to understand the links between the pollutions and the biodiversity monitoring. So very quickly, we use remote sensing with satellite imagery to monitor changes, to extract numbers, to make maps. So we have here a map from the mangrove of Pichavaram in the Tamil Nadu, showing in clear green all the restored mangrove by the forest department, and numbers at the scale of Tamil Nadu, which has doubled surfaces. We add to that botanical survey to understand the processes of these changes in terms of population biology of mangrove tree species, so the production of the trees, the species are changing. And we add to these two dimensions, interviews in order to understand uses of this resource, expectation from local populations, and in a more general way, all the local ecological knowledge on the mangroves and on its environmental dynamics. And we add the environmental DNA and heavy metals that my colleague will present right now. So Danan, you can take the floor.
Yeah.
Can you put your camera on, Sadanan? And your micro on also. Yeah, thank you.
Julian, can you switch off your this screen?
This is your slide. You can keep on.
Okay. I'm not able to see my screen. Okay.
Yes, everyone is seeing it. Don't worry.
Yeah. So as Dr. Julian has already explained, so these mangroves are at high risk of decline due to anthropogenic pressures affecting the ecological communities as well as the functioning of overall ecosystem. So among these stressors, the major stressors are the heavy metals, pesticides, and endocrine disruptors that are derived from the industries as well as the agriculture. So these contaminants are released into the aquatic environment through discharge effluents, thereby affecting the entire aquatic biota and also the mangroves. Thus, these contaminants have become a serious concern for aquatic biodiversity as well as the public health. So these are the impact of environmental contaminants on the human health. So most of these contaminants are they affect the reproductive functions and interfere with the hormone biosynthesis, and also they affect the physiological processes of homeostasis, reproduction, development, and also the behavior. Similarly, these persistent organic pollutants are highly toxic, and the major health hazards are like cancer, allergies, hypersensitivity, and damage to nervous systems. Similarly, these endocrine disruptors also disrupt the endocrine system, and various reproductive functions are also altered, affecting the overall fertility. So all these pollutants not only impact human health, but also they impact the animals as well as the wildlife species. So to investigate these impacts of environmental pollutants on aquatic biota, we will be doing the monitoring levels of environmental contaminants. We'll measure the levels of these contaminants such as heavy metals, pesticide, and few of the endocrine disruptors. And also we'll assess the aquatic biodiversity and also the species richness using eDNA technology. Because this generally we do biodiversity monitoring, which rely on field sampling, visual surveys, and individual counting. But these surveys are very laborious, intensive, and also invasive. It's time consuming. So there is a need to develop new technologies, and eDNA technology is a promising tool for biodiversity assessment and conservation, which will complement with the this field surveys. So generally, this eDNA technology uses the shaded DNA, and which is non-invasive. It's very cost-effective and less time-consuming, and also easy to implement. It also helps to monitor the health of ecosystem, and also importantly, it detects the rare and the cryptic species. So the methodology is like we collect the samples. Yeah. So we'll collect water or sediment samples from selected areas based on the information about their anthropogenic pressures, which is industry or agriculture nearby the nearby site, and then this physicochemical analysis, heavy metal analysis, and then bioindicator screening also will be done. So these preliminary studies or test will indicate whether these are undisturbed or disturbed, and also whether it has restored. So this will help us to categorize the mangroves into 3 different classification, and then we'll do the eDNA sampling and the analysis. For eDNA sampling, this is the special eDNA sampler, where there is the sample, water sample or sediment sample is collected using this motorized pump, and the filter which will have, after aspiration, there will be collection of the microorganism or the complete microbiota DNA. So this the tissue filter, what you call the this filter will be aseptically collected, and then there will be processing in the lab. So this lab is very DNA isolation, PCR, and also post PCR procedures are very critical. So and we need to avoid this contamination. That's why there should be separate labs, well equipped labs, and we are setting up these labs at NIRI. So this is the flow chart where we do the sampling. Sorry, before that, can you go before? Okay, so we'll do the DNA isolation, and then we use this next generation sequencing for amplification and biodiversity screening. And once we get the metagenomics data, we'll do the bioinformatics analysis to see the biodiversity classification using this various tools such as biodiversity R, and then what you call R program, Orbit tools for metabarcoding softwares. So over to Dr. Julian.
Okay, thank you. I hope you understand our project, and hope we have still 1 minute for one question.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, thanks a lot. We don't have much time, but at least for one question, and also just to say that you answered to a call from CEFIPRA. So we hope also there that you will have a successful answering feedback. So any question? I don't see any hand raised.
I have the
question. Go on. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that presentation. The question that I have is, we know that the mangrove species are not the same across different parts of India, and so would that also be incorporated into the kind of analysis that you are proposing about giving weights to the different drivers?
Yeah, yes, of course. You know, mangroves are different anyway. There is deltas mangrove different than estuaries mangrove, front beach, and a lot of. So all these differences might be biogeographical with the species or any kind of huge hydrological difference. You know that you take that into consideration before comparing. This is obvious, and we've been trying to select points as comparable as possible, but in natural science you never find two similar ecosystems. But this is taken into account, of course.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other question? No, so we keep for the discussion at the end. Thanks a lot. So now I would like to invite Dr. Fradri de Souza from the Energy and Resource Institute of Goa to present his paper on capacity building of small-scale artisanal fisheries in aquaculture to boost biodiversity and resource management. And but I don't see you among the people here. Are you here? No, it seems that you're not here. Well, then that means we move to Artist Radar presentation. Arti. Arti, so you are a founder trustee of the Dakshin Foundation, and he heads the Communities and Resource Government Program. You're trained in social science, and your research interests cover a range of historical and contemporary social legal studies, with a special focus on regulating resource use, environmental justice, and democratic practices. And so you will present on the question of democratizing maritime knowledge, an outline of a practice-based coastal research program. So the voice is yours.
Thanks, Blandine. Let me just share my screen and let me know if you can hear me and you can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can hear you and we see your screen.
Okay, so let me just begin quickly by saying thanks for inviting me, because I know so many people here. It's really great to hear them. And Partha, I hope I'm not sure I'll be presenting on all the things that you mentioned, but actually I'm going to draw on, take a small step back to just reflect on some practices of marine social science and draw from a collaborative research partnership that I was a part of. They mentioned here, called the Southern Collective. It's focused on the Indian Ocean. So I guess it's useful for us to, a small reminder that when we're talking about South Asian maritime knowledge, it's useful to really remember that these ideals of what constitutes valid knowledge and modernity was crafted in these cultural practices of colonial investigations, largely in the 1800s. And these kind of institutionalized legal and scientific apparatus that emerged since that time, these have continued to frame the diverse forms of fishing and maritime knowledge, still as somewhat non-modern, and in many cases even destructive, if we look at the legal frameworks. So we've seen in the other presentations also that small-scale fisheries is, it presents really diverse values in the Indian context. Where it constitutes a kind of tropical majority, to use Professor John Kurian's words, even though the agricultural statistics show that they contribute only marginally to overall productivity, but as a social demography, it's quite a vital and important sector. And in this regard, if we look at the marine social sciences, then it has been richest in the Indian context in the field of small-scale fisheries. And here too, the attention has been largely focused on fisheries sustainability, governance mechanisms, and that subset of this marine social sciences that looks at knowledge in particular has sort of done this more, with an instrumental view to maybe to intervening in the governance framework itself, and maybe presenting a certain kind of fix. But I suppose, the pandemic has shocked a whole load of us, because we've, as social scientists, been jolted into confronting certain invisible fisheries dynamics, things that we didn't understand. For instance, we got a taste of the scale of fisheries migrant workforce, or even the sector's dependence on the market for everyday life. And the severe immobility, it served really for many of us as a very important reminder that, good social science depends on being in conversation with people on the ground. So the lockdown, it's of course disrupted social science in serious ways, but physical contact, just to give an example, like these physical contact with our long-term field sites, they immediately ceased. They caused a lot of disruptions in these, waters that could be considered as the lab and the field border, but also in many long-term collaborations between researchers and practitioners. But for some of us, we also thought that it was an opportunity to maybe think about this heavy dependence and to rethink what knowledge formation actually could mean. Who might be these epistemic communities that we want to think about in the future? Okay. So I think, some of us have had some experience of leaning into technologies to overcome these minor losses. So we wondered whether we could not, when we raised funds for, say, relief activities, could we not also somehow because we were desperately locked down, try and look into technologies and see what kind of possibilities they might present for new kinds of research. So in May 2020, at the height of the lockdown, a few of us, my collaborators are listed there, we responded to a grant from the Social Science Research Council to set up something called a collaboratory, an Indian Ocean-based collaboratory. And we centered this wholly on trying to see if we could democratize knowledge now that we were somewhat cut off from the fields. Would this present a new opportunity to bring in others to actually produce this knowledge, people who were not actually cut off from those fields? So this involved, of course, trying to coordinate with at least 10 partners in 6 countries who were all heavily locked down. And it was an interesting experience. And I think that this pandemic has actually fueled many kind of epistemic reflections across the globe. So along with the calls for democratizing research practices, making them more ethical, scholars of good standing such as Ravitz and Funtovitz, they've argued that maybe this is yet another post-normal moment, and a new way of doing research is required. Many of you may be familiar with their old definition that when facts are uncertain and stakes are high and values are in dispute, this constitutes post-normality. Now, we don't have to agree with that, but I mean, for us, I think the interesting thing in this idea is the notion of trying to build a wider perspective, not necessarily just from the perspective of gaining more data, using extended peer communities. So I think this is what appealed to us, along with the prospect of actually practicing, knowledge generation in a slightly more ethical manner. So towards this, we set out to create a web platform, because I think this was the height of our imagination during lockdown. And it's interesting that we tried to turn to digital technologies and see what kind of promise they offered, because they seem to offer something. So I'll just share with you a few of these ideas. Migration diaries was one of our ideas. I mean, several of the scholars in our collaboratory had worked on migration. So the idea came to sort of curate the experiences of coastal migrant communities from across the Indian Ocean. And our team worked with researchers, but also with NGOs, trying to do skill sharing workshops over the internet, trying to conduct interviews on how to conduct interviews, how to take photographs, how to do more ethical research. And so the partners in Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and India, we really struggled to sort of experiment with this. And it helped to elicit different experiences of migration, but we're still trying to see how co-authoring will work with somebody from a more marginalized community. But I think that this is where we very starkly realize that physical presence is absolutely important to any kind of solidarity building, or even a relationship of trust in research. The next experiment that we had was called the Sea Lexicon. The idea was to kind of, draw from all the historical work that's been done on the Indian Ocean that shows that there's historical interconnectedness of this region, whether it's mobility, trade, navigation, knowledge, and so on. And so the Sea Lexicon tries to gather these connections and encourages researchers to co-write with and share from diverse regions. And it also offers editorial support to first-time writers from the field. So if any of you are also interested in partnering with us, then this is another good opportunity. We're trying to build sort of like common experiences by trying to understand what particular words mean. I'm just giving you a few examples of that here. And this is another collaboration that the Southern Collective took with the University of Paris. And we have one of our collaborators here, which is Marine Aldada. And sorry, just a minute. And so the Asian Vestry is their idea of, it's partly a pedagogical project and also a knowledge sharing instrument to really curate what kind of relations are there between humans and non-humans in this space and this part of the world. And we're hoping that in the next iteration of it, we can bring more marine beasts to to the fore. And here, what is critical is that students of, sort of enter into a kind of a writing relationship with the scholars to actually produce and curate some essays on what they have researched about various species in these contexts. So anyway, all of these are still in their sort of development stages, and we'll share it with you as soon as they're ready. And finally, of course, I mean, as social scientists, as part of a collaboration, we had to write something. So we actually ended up curating about 12 essays, which were, we invited all these scholars from across the space to really talk about their experience of having to do immobile research and whether that actually changed their methodological practices. And so we've kind of published this as a reflexive sort of piece termed Connected Ethnographies. And it's on the Society for Cultural Anthropology's website, so please do take a look. So yeah, I mean, what did we sort of understand with our, with these new ideas of trying to democratize research practices, the pandemic being a moment of post-normality? I mean, what were the possibilities that we found? One is, I think that it brings back, of course, like, these are moments to turn inward, and therefore to really harness what Pierre Bourdieu has called reflexivity in the social sciences, which basically draws attention to the fact that social scientists are equally, in many ways, responsible for creating worlds and, and constructing worlds. So it helps us to push the boundaries of what we would consider as valid methodologies, and muddy what in the ecological sciences, the lab and the field border has been studied, and in the social sciences also there is such a divide, and it helps us to sort of muddy it when we get into these kind of new practices. But we also found that this post-normality is a very limited sort of epistemological, I think, practice if who we are considering as these extended peer communities, whether it's fishers or migrants and so on, if they have very poor engagement with science policy continuance. And of course, there's several limitations which I'm happy to share with Marine at some point, because the digital promise, I think, really taught us much more that human presence is really vital for collaboration, particularly when you want to democratize and involve people who haven't had the same opportunities. And of course, this kind of thinking, it embeds a reformist agenda for social sciences, which I think is really vital given the political moment in India at this point. So even the frameworks that we choose to analyze our social sciences that Partha gave us a good, menu of, I think we may want to choose these to see which ones actually help us democratize a bit more, so that we don't sit in these binaries of what are thought and action, or what means what's in the realm of science and what's in the realm of law, policy, or activism. So yeah, thanks. And these are photos taken from all of these friends, and I invite any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we have 5 minutes for question before going to the general discussion.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure. Go on, Partha.
Thanks, Aarti. Not a question, so much as sharing something related to the work that you've done. This is very fascinating and extremely important given the context of what we are going through. So in one of our projects, not the fish coast, but another one, we've been using a lot of visual techniques also with communities in Sundarbans, but also here with the Kolivadas of Mumbai, photo voice, even videos. So giving, having workshops with communities, discussing issues that are important for them, and then asking them to think them through, and then make videos and photographs, and then building stories around them. We've actually published one of these, but what we are planning to do is to have some kind of curated online exhibition where we will actually showcase these photos and videos, and then invite community members to actually come online during particular times to respond to questions and comments from other stakeholders. The yeah, that's one thing that we are doing. The second thing is also we've been organizing stakeholder roundtables where instead of only calling academics and NGOs and government officials, we've been asking people from the community, especially the youth. And so they're not just expressing their own perspectives, they're able to ask questions to others. So that I think is a very important kind of exercise when they can ask questions to a government official or even to an academic, to a scientist about how they perceive problems. So one of the women fishers we were talking to, for example, said that this year we had a cyclone every month. Okay, and it's not that she was just exaggerating. Right? There's a particular way in which they understand the weather, and then you have to go back and see what happened in those 4-5 months, because it was we in the city of Bombay may not have felt that as a cyclone, but for them they faced significant damage in these events. So I think these were some of the ways in which we are trying to also innovate on what we can do while not being able to physically visit the field sites. But I agree with you that it's not simply about doing research, but it's also about how we can do things that actually give agency, and therefore I think this democratizing from below, I think that's very important. I think we'll be happy to. So we have a couple of COLI PhD students who are actually working on these, and we hope to get them to also write reflective pieces on what they did in their own Koliwadas, their own fishing villages during the pandemic. We'll be happy to talk to you more about this later.
Yeah, thanks, Partha. I mean, just as a quick response to you, I think this is there's something peculiar about the way marine social sciences is practiced, particularly by embedded marine social scientists from India. And it tends to be of this variety which is called post-normal, but actually it is a much older class categories are also there, kind of straddling an activist and scholar, maybe binary. But yes, it's to sort of, I think, complicate those identities for us in our own practices will help us, I think, choose the kind of questions that are a bit more relevant for our particular context. So yes, we should all talk about that. Yeah.
Thank you. So maybe we can have now a general discussion, taking into account all the different presentation, and if some of you can put your camera on, then it's maybe easier to discuss together. And you're welcome. I don't know if you want to put your micro on or just raise the hand, as you wish. Yeah, who wants to begin? Yeah, Marine, go on.
Yeah, I want to reflect on what Arti was saying about the use of digital tools for our research for this meeting. And for instance, Partha was talking about like online exhibition or how to valorize our work. All of us, we are meeting today virtually, and all of us, we are collecting a lot of material that we want to share and make visible. So I think that a collective thinking around how we use these digital tools is fundamental today. I think Arti said it, like the physical encounter is still much more powerful, but when we are not able to have it, how can we use wisely these tools? I think there is a whole agenda for scholars to be able to use this tool also as a connectivity between what Arti is doing with the different projects she's involved in, between the scholars and other publics. And even if there are a lot of barriers to digital, and Arti already talked about it, it's still a mean where you can at least put together people and keep traces of this interaction so that everybody can see it. So I think it's already something very useful, but then there are a lot of questions behind it. Who is able to read? In the project we did together with RT about the students. So students today that have access to this kind of content or that have access to our papers and the production we are doing, it's a very big question because a lot of these contents are not accessible for many students, especially in the global south, because accessing this content is expensive. So it's just a broad discussion about the fact that we are all working on this area, this region. We are all producing knowledge around it. And we are all facing the same kind of issues around valorization, sharing, and deconstructing and reconstructing differently our production. So I think it's really a common topic. And then also across the Indian Ocean, which is another topic because there are languages issues. And
can I just add to what Marine just said?
Yeah, sure. And
yeah, I agree that I think that, you know, in some ways this is a cross-cutting some sort of phenomenon in all our presentations, which I think it may be good to sort of highlight that whether it's coastal transformation or whether it is regulation of this transformation in any sense, quite a bit of it is dependent on technologies that are not very easily accessible. Yet some of the resistances that Partha has been talking about, you know, they have been very effective even with much lower grade technologies or techniques. So when you look at coastal mapping or, you know, yeah, those kind of contestations, which you're producing particular kinds of evidence that will go in favor of one party or the other. So in terms of coastal conflicts or coastal conservation in general, I feel like there's a lot to be, for us to think about in terms of technologies of, you know, even regulation. And probably something that's maybe, you know, we haven't talked about so much when we're talking about legal pluralism and such, because they also tend to have a life of their own that forces us as actors to engage principally with those technologies. So the digital might be a good common research agenda for this group.
Thanks a lot. I'm sorry, it's difficult for me to participate because the sound is really bad on my side and I just cannot follow the sentence of the discussion. So please go on. Does anybody wants to react or to ask to? Yes.
Dilsha here from NIOT.
Sure.
Yeah. See, India has the longest coastline, and so our people are also living along on the coastline that we cannot avoid. So industry and development and products and all these things pollute the area. And what's a general solution we can suggest?
I don't know who wants to take that.
Solution, I don't know who wants to answer that.
Because it is a societal, and it is the longest, and coastline is the most, and again even tropical monsoon or is a tropical area, and again industry and all the development, and people are also staying and living in the coastline mostly. So I could go through all the presentations were very good and again very impressive. And again, when you tell about the coastal ocean acidification and again mangrove protection and again getting back all the restoration of the mangrove and again coral reefs, everything, these are all related. So once there is a development, then we are seeing the disadvantages.
Can I just say something, maybe building on what Sir is just saying?
Sure.
Yeah, so this is I think all these presentations, when we're talking about Indian science or social science in India, we sort of have to take this as a start point. India has a long coastline, it has people all over it. And this, I think, many of us are very keenly aware of this, because otherwise, some of these ideas that have worked, for example, in European countries, of how you can build the science and the science will seamlessly transfer itself to society or to policy. I think that gets extremely complicated in these very diverse democracies, sir. So if you see India not just as high population, but big democracy and a vibrant democracy, then what Partha was also talking about, that it requires this kind of engagement outside of research. Like if you say, research is a separate space and policy is a separate space. So this Habermasian communicative rationality of, somewhere somebody will generate the science and then it will just go like that into practice. That's why there is no one solution. And I think it makes sense in India to just put that on the plate and say that, we need a different way of doing science, at least social science. Natural science can learn also, I think, from these practices.
I think also there are...
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, I don't have solutions, but, there are frameworks already, like Arati has written about things like EIA and CRZ. We have laws which of course have been watered down over the last couple of decades, but we do have legal frameworks in which discussion and participation of these communities you're talking about is actually very much part of these legal frameworks. Now, it's one thing that they've been watered down over time and they continue to be, but as they were, for example, CRZ in 1991, at least to the best of my understanding, was meant to be a legislation that addressed some of the concerns, Professor, that you're talking about. So these were, concerns of being precautionary on the coast and only allowing certain types of activities which were required, and recognizing that fishing communities primarily were the main claimants of this coastal area. Now, the problem, of course, is that over time, all of this has been watered down. So we need to reflect about some of the decisions. Of course, these are very complicated, as you said. I mean, the other side of the story is, like in some of the work that we've been doing and Partha has been doing, when you talk about something like industrialization, the response from this generic category of community is also very complicated. There are people who perhaps look at industry as an opportunity. There are perhaps others who do not look at it as an opportunity. But the only way you can really have these discussions is if the legal framework and the process of development is inclusive in the way that it operates. You actually have discussions about these things. And I think that is what is being eroded, has been eroded, and is continuously being eroded more and more in the recent past. So I think that is something we need to reflect upon.
Thank you. Let me also add this. And I think, Professor Dinesh, you asked an important question, but a very tough question. And it's not easily amenable to solutions. That doesn't mean that we can't keep trying. And I would like to add to what Ajit just said, that we have had frameworks. So in addition to the CRZ, we also have, for example, the what is it? ICM, Integrated Coastal Management Frameworks, which Martin Bawing has been talking about. My colleague Arun Namdar has been talking about it with many of the government coastal maritime board and port trust and all of those. So there are these frameworks available to sort of balance development with coastal conservation, protection, biodiversity, and all of these. One of our PhD students, brought out a very good critique of the CRZ, pointing out how there's very little science behind the decision support that it offers, and came up with an alternate decision support system so that we can avoid very fragile and risky coastal areas when we're planning urban development or other projects. But the problem with that kind of framework as it emerged was also that this can be easily manipulated and misused, like it has happened with CRZ. But I would like to say something slightly different when we're thinking about solutions, because now we are no longer living in a world where we can talk about development being important for coastal areas, because the damage caused by climate change related hazards is huge, and we are seeing in coastal cities, Kolkata and Chennai and Bombay, the kind of huge environmental losses runs into billions of dollars. So we need to think about adaptation now, and therefore focusing on the mangroves, the coastal wetlands, conservation, biodiversity, the livelihoods of the fishers actually yields significant benefits in terms of protection from these climate change hazards, in terms of mitigating losses. I think that is the way to go now, and not think in terms of only the developmental pathways which coastal zones offer.
Thank you, Pata. Katel Cuisine, you want to?
Yes. Well, I'm not from social science, but I would like to contribute to some things that I heard right now. Something saying, okay, there might be a difference between India and Europe in terms of the way science transfers to society. I really don't think so. I think we have serious gaps between science and society, and it reveals in the pandemic situations, first for health issues, but then going to the coastal zone, mainly because I'm interested. I've been involved here in some reflection with politics about the submersion of the European coast, because it happens also in Europe. And there are some cities that are going to disappear. And when I was in these meetings, I noticed that there was like some institutional stops, or I would say breaks, to the diffusion of the information to the public, due to the politics themselves, that they didn't want that the people know that the city might disappear, because they would lose their jobs. Simply this, they will lose their importance. And one of the reflections we have here in the south of France is that the states would like the people to move from the coast inland, but the municipalities that are on the coast, they don't want this, because if the people start to go back inland, then they will lose their power. And it's important this also to have this in mind, and that makes people, the normal people, I mean the butcher, the baker, not to be aware that the sea is rising. And if you ask to the people in Europe, most of them do not know that the sea is rising. It's surprising. You think it's all the time in the media, but there are still people planning to buy houses near the coast. So making this error. So I think we shouldn't think that it's different, India and Europe. I think it's everywhere the same. And I think here what I hear most is that education is the only way of going really the solution. If we want to find a solution, is sharing, and that's what you said, Arti. Engagement is sharing through education to the very young people about what we think we know. And I say we think we know, because I'm afraid that climate change is not completely written.
Thanks a lot. Well, after that,
I would like to leave now.
Yeah.
Sorry, I can't stay till the end.
Sure, go on.
Yeah, thank you all.
Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted to speak about that.
No, I was just saying I need to leave now.
You need to leave. Sorry, I didn't hear properly.
Yeah,
well,
and so my apologies for not staying till the end, but thank you all for
in fact,
very interesting discussion.
This session was until now, so thanks a lot to everybody, and let's keep in touch to see what if there could be project exchanges that we can share, or that on project on which we can collaborate together. And thank you a lot for your participation.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.